this approach is seeking to provide an evolution of safety standards, which, taken without other measures and reforms, ensures that the safety of people in tall buildings, both new and existing. We're clear that the government is clear that existing and upcoming single staircase buildings are not inherently unsafe. There is no evidence to suggest single staircase buildings require remediation or mitigation when built in accordance with the relevant standards, are well maintained and properly managed. And finally, I think Lord Gore, one of the you asked why are there no peers in the fire services. It is a very good question. I'm afraid currently that's not within my remit, as I say currently, but you know, it's a point well made, let's say. As I say, there's been lots of great points been raised, and I'm absolutely, in response to, as Lord Tuck said, there's lots of points made. There are far too many that I've tried to address them, I've tried to listen at the same time, so you have to please forgive me that I will have to, where I can, follow up. I know that I'm also acutely aware not everyone will be entirely satisfied with everything I say. As I say, I'll try and respond if I can on the other issues. And in closing, I would just like to genuinely thank people for their contributions in this debate. The reforms we have delivered will take time to fully implement and take hold, and we will reflect on the many points raised today as we continue to monitor the impacts that our reforms have had. And it's something obviously other noble lords did ask about. And I would just like to finish by assuring the House of the government's enduring commitment to improved fire safety as we seek to ensure everyone is safe and feels safe in the buildings within which they live and work.
Thank you. Can I thank all members for taking part in this debate, which I put down in some trepidation because it seemed a little bit dry and a little bit, if you like, technical. But the expertise in this House just shows itself again from all four corners. And it would be wrong for me to name any individual peers, but the knowledge is in this building. The knowledge is in these members, and these are life-changing decisions that we make on behalf of the public out there. And just a couple of positive things. I mean, one, Pierre talked about the Ukraine, and I was fortunate enough on the last day of the sitting before the summer recess with Ronnie King, we went to see the Ukrainian minister at his embassy. And he commented and supported on the support of the British Fire Service in delivering things to the Ukraine and keeping it. And in their darkest hour, when they needed turntable ladders and all that equipment, with the fire service was there, taking the kit out there and dropping it off. And this is the first time I've had a chance to just to thank, on behalf of Ronnie and the APVG, the Ukrainian minister for actually bringing that up with us. And you are a new minister, and this is probably your first, dare I say, baptism of fire? Perhaps not, but there are questions that need clarifying and need answering, because some of the things to right-minded, simple-minded people like myself just seem unfathomable. And I think, you know, Lord Coker there has asked those questions on my behalf because of the time. And if people think that we do care or we don't care, a number of speakers today went over the time, which was 12 minutes, which is a long time to speak. And that's because the passion, and that's because the knowledge that they're trying to impart to you to take back to the other people in the other place to make things safer. So on behalf of everybody, I thank the Minister for listening and for his replies, and I would like to move. Thank you.
Well done, Dave.
This motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content. The content have it. Question for short debate. Proposed loan of the Elgin Marbles to Greece. Lord Lexton.
My Lords, the Elgin Marbles, or Parthenon sculptures as some prefer, are famous for two reasons. The first reason is, of course, because they are magnificent treasures of civilization, part of the heritage of our world. The second reason that they are famous is as regrettable as it is persistent. These great treasures have an almost infinite capacity to provoke heated arguments about their ownership and their location. It is almost impossible to mention them in everyday conversation without instigating a dispute on these points. This has not always been the case. The sculptures were brought to our country by the 7th Earl of Elgin, about whom many unkind things are said, between 1801 and 1812. They were placed in the possession of the British Museum by Act of Parliament in 1816. For the next 165 years, there was scarcely a peep of protest from anyone in Greece, which had become an independent country in 1832, about their residence in one of the world's greatest museums. During this long period, the idea that the British Museum's possession was permanent became a settled conviction in Britain. The peace was shattered some 40 years ago. Since then, politicians and other leading figures in Greece, a country whose friendship has always been greatly valued in Britain, have repeatedly demanded that the treasures should be installed once again on the Acropolis, from which, in the Greek view, they were illegally removed by the much criticised Lord Elgin. No one, I think, can doubt the strength of feeling that exists in Greece. It has the power to damage and blight good relations between our two countries, particularly at official and diplomatic levels. People of goodwill in both Greece and Britain must surely seek to diminish the acrimony with which the heated and recurrent arguments engendered by dispute over ownership and location have invested the great and famous sculptures. Those seeking to understand the issues more fully will be greatly assisted by a recent detailed study by one of our leading scholars, Sir Noel Malcolm, a most distinguished historian of international standing, with a particular interest in the Balkans, a Fellow of the British Academy and at All Souls, Oxford. Sir Noel Malcolm's particular scholarly study was published earlier this year by Policy Exchange, an organisation of enormous value in promoting debate on political and public affairs. Not all scholars reach clear conclusions. Sir Noel Malcolm does so. He finds the claim that the removal of the treasures was illegal to be false. He finds the claim that Elgin saved the treasures from serious damage, dispersal and destruction to be true. The central point is this: the British Museum has full legal entitlement to the treasures which Elgin saved for posterity. It should perhaps be noted that no Greek government, I think, has ever sought any form of legal judgment on the question of ownership, yet the words theft and robbery are freely bandied about on the Greek side. My Lords, the absence of serious doubt on the question of legal ownership is, of course, immensely important, but it does not settle an issue of this kind definitively. I sought the view of a retired Conservative minister, an academic philosopher, well known for his careful consideration of all sides of highly contested issues. He told me that, in his view, the Elgin Marbles have a special and disproportionate importance for the Greeks, which sets them apart from almost anything else that has ended up outside its own mother country. Should not this view incline us to consider sympathetically the Greek demand for the transfer of the sculptures from London to Athens? But must not great weight, also be given to the fact that in over more than 200 years, the Elgin Marbles have become part of Britain's cultural heritage? Some assert that a mere 200 years are of no significance in the roughly 2,500-year-long history of the sculptures. But that is to ignore the important fact that these 200 years constitute the great majority of the period during which, in post-classical times, the sculptures have been seriously valued as works of art. Professor Mary Beard, who has done so much to extend understanding of the ancient world, has said that after 200 years, the Elgin Marbles have a history that roots them in the British Museum as well as in Athens. Surely such a statement confers great merit on the suggestion that has been given wide publicity that some form of loan arrangement might be instituted between the British Museum and the Greek government. Mr. George Osborne, the current chairman of the British Museum Trustees, has become the principal champion of this idea. He tells us not infrequently that he is exploring ways in which a loan scheme might be agreed with the Greek government, with, as he put it recently, Greek treasures coming our way in return. My lords, at present, a loan is the only basis on which any of the Elgin marbles could go to Greece. They are the property of the museum, which is prohibited by Act of Parliament from selling them or giving them to anyone else. A loan would be wholly compatible with the British Museum Act 1963, which states that the trustees of the British Museum may lend for public exhibition. It is a power that the trustees have not in the past been reluctant to use. The 1963 Act goes on to state that in deciding whether or not to lend any such object and determining the time for which and the conditions subject to which any such object is to be lent, the trustees shall have regard to the interests of students and other persons visiting the museum. This surely rules out open-ended, potentially permanent arrangements. There is another crucial issue. In any agreement with Greece, the museum would need to be certain that it would get its property back. The current policy on loans makes clear that the trustees of the British Museum will lend only in circumstances where the perceived risk to the object is considered reasonable and where the borrower guarantees the object will be returned to the museum at the end of the loan period. And so, my lords, if proposals for a loan, the subject of this debate, are to succeed, two essential preconditions would surely have to be met. First, the Greek government would need to give a binding, legally enforceable commitment to restore the sculptures to their owner at the end of the loan period. Second, the length of the loan period would need to be firmly established. On the latter, various possibilities have been mentioned, ranging, I think, from 5 to 15 years. May I ask my noble friend the Minister whether the government has a view on the maximum time the sculptures should be on loan from the British Museum? And would the government seek to ensure that a loan agreement fully respected the British Museum's ownership of the Elgin marbles? My lords, would it not be wholly wrong in seeking an agreement with Greece to jeopardise the interests of the British people? Though the British Museum may at present have its difficulties, which will keep Mr. Osborne busy, it has never failed in its duty to hold the Elgin marbles securely, in its own words, for the benefit of the world public, present and future.
My lords, for the benefit of the House, I'd just like to tell noble lords that we do have two noble lords wishing to speak in the gap. They've given notice of that. It's an incredibly tight debate, and so I'm sure we want to hear from everyone and the Minister's reply in full, and so I implore all noble lords to stick to the speaking time.
I'm grateful. My lords, not for the first time, I find myself congratulating the noble Lord Lexton for bringing such an important and timely debate. I'm afraid that I will disagree with much of what he has said, including on matters of history, and I say that with some trepidation to such an established historian, but there are different views about matters that have already been cited in your Lordship's House. The Prime Minister's recent snub of the Greek Premier for even discussing his country's well-known and long-established claim for the reunification of the Parthenon sculptures in their Athenian home was more worthy of a sulking adolescent than an aspiring statesman. And I do slightly balk at the idea of the recipient of stolen goods agonising about their possible loan to the rightful owner. I'm afraid I do not accept, and there are, whatever policy exchange may say, perhaps legislate for with a flick of a pen, there are other views, and I do not currently accept that Lord Elgin had permission from the Ottoman Empire to hack away at the marbles with crowbars and take them for the adornment of his Scottish mansion. He was authorised, I believe, only to take impressions. He only sold them to the British Museum after his subsequent bankruptcy. There, like much of our imperial history, they were scrubbed with wire wool, which did lasting damage. I will not, my lords, fast forward to recent governance troubles at the British Museum and the still unresolved systematic thefts from its mostly undisplayed treasures. But I think we might observe that the right to call itself the Museum of the World, etc., is wearing extremely thin. However, regardless of arguments about legality, past or present, the British people know better than too many of their leaders how to make friends by being the bigger person. Most of them support returning the artefacts to the people to whom they mean so much more. And a few minutes, let alone hours, at the Acropolis Museum in Athens would lead any noble lord to understand just how much these artefacts mean to the people of Greece. Few have been fooled by years of buck-passing between museum and government around this issue, when technological advancement should make sharing and return so much easier than ever before. My lords, I fear the government is taking the concept of culture war to new and ever more literal levels. It is prepared to legislate to change facts, as found by our highest court, so as to transport desperate human cargo to Rwanda. But it's not prepared to legislate to allow the British Museum and other important collections even to make their own decisions about cooperation and vision over world heritage. It wants to stop the boats, stop the courts, and burn the bridges, my lords. But the government's marbles are long since lost.
My lords, I wanted to take part in this debate because I love ancient artefacts, so much so that my career began in ruins, working as a field archaeologist, trowel in hand, and please indulge me, it is panto season. Even now I feel a shivering excitement at the memory of scraping back the dirt to reveal a sarcophagus lid and then lifting it to find the tomb still occupied in skeletal form. My lords, what is special about artefacts is that they conjure up stories when we see, touch or smell them, and the sniffing part doesn't apply to skeletons, that would be weird, but there's nothing like a whiff of old alabaster. And it is this storytelling function that I believe should be front of mind when we consider objects like the Parthenon sculptures, recognising, as Lord Lexon said, that location and context are important elements in how they speak to us. And as I have bounced between the British Museum and the New Acropolis Museum, each of which holds around half of the surviving Parthenon sculptures, I felt two quite different narratives emerge from these kindred objects. In London, the story is heavily weighted in favour of their recent history. They speak of 19th century adventurers, of the neoclassical London architecture they influenced, of a Britain that prized Latin and Greek education above all else, and of a world of comparative cultural and artistic studies. While in Athens, the story is very much one of them as integral architectural features of the Parthenon building that you can see from the gallery, of their position relative to other layers of Greek archaeology, and of their representation of classical Athenian culture. My lords, one of the most powerful differences is in their positioning. The Duveen Gallery has them facing inwards, while the New Acropolis Museum has them turned outwards, replicating their original arrangement on the Parthenon. They are quite literally introverted in London and extroverted in Athens. My lords, I hope we can recognise, as Lord Lexon set out, that each of these stories is interesting and valuable, and that we don't allow a lack of imagination to cause us to dismiss either of them out of hand. My personal preference, as my tone may have given away, is for the Athenian story, so I do wish to see the entire set of sculptures together in the New Acropolis Museum. But I recognise that this would represent a loss to those who favour the London narrative if they can no longer drop into the British Museum for a fix of their own preferred kind of classical inspiration. My lords, artefacts also add new elements to their stories over time, and this is especially true for the Parthenon sculptures, as well as Lord Elgin himself. Their story now includes Melina Mercouri, who kicked off that campaign 40 years ago, and Eleni Cubitt, who ran the UK campaign for their return over many years. Our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has now become part of the story, and George Osborne may be an even bigger figure if he leads the trustees to agree to some form of display in Athens. That's certainly my hope, that we will find a way to have the entire set of sculptures singing their story out from the new Acropolis Museum, while the British Museum continues to tell its rich stories through other fabulous Greek objects from its own collection or from loans. Our Prime Minister really recently issued a clarion call for politicians not to feel bound by others' past decisions, but rather to be willing to make long-term decisions for a brighter future. I think that's the question that now sits in front of the British Museum trustees. And if it does seem that it's better for the next chapter of the sculpture story to be set in Athens, then I hope we can enable that to happen. I'd like to close with a question to the Minister, my Lords, and that's really to invite him to give an aesthetic opinion, as well as legalistic ones I suspect he has in his notes. I think it would be helpful for the House to know what Lord Parkinson's personal preference for Parthenon placement is.
Join others in thanking my noble friend Lord Lexton for securing this debate. I think it is right we should debate this because it can't be left just to museums. There is obviously room, I think, to debate the legal case, and I do think that Lord Elgin's actions possibly were a little murky, but I do think, nevertheless, our legal case is good. I also think it's not the point. The point is what we do now, rather than what happened in the past. And I've never personally been so convinced by the moral, artistic and cultural arguments for the position we take. I think the Parthenon marbles are a special situation and we should try and find a special solution. They are one of the supreme expressions of ancient Greek, hence Western art. They were created for a specific building, a specific cultural context. And in contrast to much ancient sculpture, we know exactly what that context was and what the work of art was intended to signify. They aren't just random museum exhibits, and for as long as they're not seen as a whole, they are less than the sum of their parts. Now, I was lucky enough to learn Greek in Greece when the Foreign Office still invested in such things, and I've lived in Cyprus. I've no doubt been influenced by that experience, but it has also enabled me to see the argument from the Greek perspective. And for us, the marbles are just one, albeit very important, exhibit in our national museums. But for Greece, they're part of the national identity, they're a national cultural cause. And as we saw from the, I'm afraid, slightly dismissive treatment of Prime Minister Mitsotakis the other week, they do have the capacity to disrupt a relationship that really ought to be a lot better than it is. So I do think we should try to find a solution. But I do wonder also whether a loan is the right way forward. I admit I'm slightly unconvinced by it. It seems like a solution that has been shaped by the existence of the 1963 Act, which rightly prohibits the museum from alienating its collections, and I'm afraid nowadays that's a very necessary protection against the tendencies of too many museum curators. But the problem with a loan is that it keeps the issue and the arguments alive, and I think we should try and settle this for good. My personal view on this is that it's time for a grand gesture, and only the government can make it. It is to offer to return the marbles as a one-off gift to Greece from this country, but as part of, and on condition of, a new wider Anglo-Greek cultural partnership. And that partnership could have three elements, but many others. First of all, a museum partnership, high-quality reproductions of the marbles in London, plus an agreement by Greece to loan some of its most famous works of art temporarily in return, maybe beyond London as well. Second, a wider cultural partnership, a bilateral foundation, perhaps largely financed by the, I'm sure, many wealthy private individuals with an interest in this question, to try and take academic and scholarly collaboration to a new level, and an agreement to relax or eliminate restrictions, because the barriers are much stronger on the Greek side than ours, on language teaching, cultural work, artistic performance by each other's citizens, and so on. And third, and finally, a joint campaign to return to Greece those parts of the marbles that are in other museums globally, for it should not be forgotten that although the British Museum has most of those that aren't in Athens, it doesn't have them all. Now, such a partnership would have to definitively set aside for good the rights and wrongs of the original acquisition. It would also have to be clear it wasn't a precedent for restitution demands for any other museum exhibit. But it would show that we actually mean it when we see these marbles as part of our common inheritance, that we can move beyond the what we have, we hold approach we take on so many occasions. Perhaps we could rise to the occasion this time and make a deal.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the noble Lord Frost and entirely agree with everything that he just said. I think the noble Lord said the Parthenon sculptures sitting in the British Museum are less than a sum of their parts that they would be if they were together in their original context with their original structure. I think that reflects a recent article in the Times that talks about going into the Parthenon Sculptures Gallery and feeling the melancholy of exile. These marbles have been deprived of the charisma that ancient objects can have when they're in the place where they were made and created and lived with for thousands of years. Now, I have to say that I was a volunteer at the British Museum for many years, and I'm a passionate lover of the place. And one of the things that I did as a volunteer was to sit in the galleries, stand in the galleries with ancient objects and give visitors the chance to hold them. And one of the objects I did that with was a 350,000-year-old hand axe from Kent. And that was a magic object when you felt it in your hand. But it was a magic object in its place, in its time. You could feel the connection to the people. They were probably Homo heidelbergensis or possibly early Neanderthals, the people who lived before us on this island, and you were experiencing in that moment. And there is something that we are depriving the world, anyone who visits Athens, of by taking the Parthenon sculptures away. Now, like others, I thank the noble Lord Lexton for the chance for this debate. And like the noble Lady Baroness Chakrabarty, who I think has set out the case very well, which I'm not going to repeat it, I do disagree with the noble Lord Lexton's conclusions, and I think they are very much contested. But I'm, perhaps typically as a Green, going to take this as a chance to think a bit more broadly. This is a chance to reassess the position of many objects in the British Museum. The Benin bronzes are another very obvious example. But actually, let's think about our museums, our galleries, our collections, and Britain's place in the world, and place this in the context of Britain's place in the world. We hear a great deal of talk of Britain wishing to be world-leading, of Britain wishing to stand up for human rights and the rule of law, doing the right thing, a proper international order. Well, let's think about that and think about what we could actually do. And I'm no legal draftsperson, but I'm sure the Table Office could come up with a bill that would see the government directing museums, galleries and other institutions to make, over time, an assessment of their entire collections to see if they have fair and just and rightful title to the objects in those collections. I would ask the government to provide some modest ongoing funding. I'm not saying this is something that would happen in a year or even a decade. It could be an ongoing program, and we could already identify some of the objects that would clearly be a problem. And noble lords may say, well, what would that achieve? Well, I pick up the point the noble Lord Allen made about the sculptures here in London send out a message of celebration still of that period of colonialism, of exploitation, of extraction, of straight-out theft. And we'd be saying that's not the kind of world we want to live in. We want to build, create a new and different future, one that respects the rule of law, one that respects different cultures all around the world, and that seeks to work with them to celebrate together the wonderful creativity of humans all around the world, all kinds of different cultures, and how that's a global tradition that belongs to everyone, that should be all in its rightful place.
My Lords, I'm sure I'm not the only member of this House who was embarrassed when our Prime Minister said he wouldn't meet the Greek Prime Minister because of an argument about the Parthenon marbles. It seemed to me, whatever the rights and wrongs, if the British government said, to the Greek Prime Minister, it's a condition of our meeting you that you don't mention the marbles. That seems to me quite absurd. This is not how we deal with friends, fellow NATO members, a fellow European country, and a country with which we've had a long period of friendship. I find that very embarrassing, and I think we have to restore our relations with Greece because they've taken a bit of a knock. I thought the Greek Prime Minister appeared on television in a very dignified response, impeccable English and a dignified response, and I think that is how we should have behaved. My Lords, the case for returning the marbles to Athens. People say, can't do it, it would set a precedent. I don't agree with Baroness Bennett. The argument that people are using is it would set a precedent and therefore we mustn't do it because there'll be demands for everything to be returned and so on. Emphatically, I would argue that the argument in favour of the returning the marbles to Greece is because they are unique. It would not set a precedent. They are unique for a number of reasons. One is the unity of a great work of art. It's not a matter of returning the odd French impressionists to Paris, nor do we want to, nor do the French ask for it. But it is a unified work of art, or it should be, and therefore there's a case for it all to be together in its original home. Secondly, some other countries have already done this. I understand there are parts of the Parthenon marbles which have been returned to Athens, and there are other countries, I think the Austrians, are considering doing the same thing. And of course we've got the precedent of the Benin bronzes. But above all, and I learnt this some years ago when I was discussing the matter with people in Greece, the significance of the Parthenon marbles in terms of Greek culture and in terms of Greek traditions. It is so important to the people of Greece. It matters so much to them. And I think we should respect their particular wish and their desire. And then there's the argument about loaning or returning them. I appreciate there's a difficulty because of the 1963 Act. Nevertheless, I think the right answer in the fullness of time would be to return the marbles to their rightful place in Athens. I think it could be done. If it needs a change in legislation, that could be achieved. But for heaven's sake, we can't forever fall out with our Greek friends on this particular issue. We could have replicas created and put in the British Museum so that people want to see them without going to Athens. They could do so. But I think the importance to the Greeks is something which I didn't understand until I was in Athens and began talking to people. It is overwhelmingly significant for them, and we should respect that. And that is the best way forward. They are friends, they are fellow NATO members, and I think we need all the friends we've got as a country, and the Greeks would make excellent friends. They have been excellent friends, and they'd be even better friends if we return the marbles to them.
My Lords, if there were a way of returning the marbles to the Parthenon itself, there'd be no debate. It would have happened years ago. What Byron called the wanton and useless defacement would have been undone. Who could resist seeing those magnificent artefacts in their proper place? Their solidity combined with this ethereal feel of their bare, bleached, marmoreal splendour, their realism, the flowing robes and the flared horses' nostrils, nonetheless combining with this idealized beauty. But the argument is about moving them from one museum to another. And it seems to me, therefore, that this debate turns on what is a museum for. Museums, the clue is in the etymology. They're there to channel the muses, to elevate and ennoble the condition of visitors. And so it seems to me the most pertinent questions to ask with a display of any artifacts are, where will they be best looked after? Where will they be most accessible to specialists, scholars, and students? Where will people most appreciate their cultural impact? And where will the greatest number of people get to see them? Now, I think I'm right in saying that the British Museum was the first public institution to use the word British in its title, and yet it never saw its aspiration as being national. It always saw its role as being encyclopedic, as being a collection of curios from every continent. And this is more unusual than you might think. If you go to the museums in Copenhagen or Budapest or Prague, you will find museums that tell the story of a particular nation, a particular people. If you go to the museums in Washington, D.C., you find even more ethnic particularism. You find a Chinese-American museum and an African-American museum and a museum of the American Indian and so on, but the British Museum never saw itself in those terms. Confident, at least in the 18th century, in its foundation, it saw itself as a repository for the greatest works of mankind. Neil MacGregor, who was the director between 2002 and 2015, put it like this: "The museum remains a unique repository for the achievements of human endeavour, and there is no culture, past or present, that is not represented within its walls. It is truly the memory of mankind." So it seems to me the question is, what overrides that claim? And the main argument that one hears, and we've heard it in the debate now, is one of, if you like, a communal cultural claim. We live in a particular area, and therefore we have a right. And it seems to me that that is a notion that is very difficult to reconcile with ownership and contract, even if it were true. I mean, I actually don't think that we are remotely connected to whatever Neanderthal people made, the hand axe that Baroness Bennett was talking about. There was an ice age in between and the place was completely depopulated. I have no idea whether the Greeks of today are related to the Greeks of the time of the Parthenon. We're told by Constantine Porphyrogenitus that there was massive demographic displacement in the meantime. But even if they are, even if the Greek Prime Minister could claim personal lineal descent from Phidias, so what? Right? If the noble Baroness's great-grandmother had bought her house from mine, I wouldn't be allowed to turf her out because of some prior claim, because contract and ownership count for something. Now, I happen to agree with what my noble friend Lord Lexden said, or quoted Professor Mary Beard as saying that if you want to play the game of identity politics, 200 years of being debated in this chamber and revered and argued over and sketched and painted in this country also establishes some claim. But I don't think that that's really the relevant criterion. The relevant criterion is one of ownership. And if, as my noble friend Lord Frost says, these are the foundation of Western art, then free contract is surely the foundation of Western civilization.
My Lords, and especially Lord Lexden, I'd like to welcome this excellent short debate on the Elgin Marbles. I want to stand back from the specifics of to loan or not to loan argument and avoid the tit-for-tat row over ownership, because I fear this technical approach can distract us from why these sculptures really matter. We should not lose sight of the marbles' value as sublime works of art, the quality of their artistry, what Virginia Woolf described as their immense and enduring beauty after millennia. And I'd urge we refocus the public discussion to the sculpture's significance in the history of the accomplishments of Western civilization. I was reminded of this when rereading Tiffany Jenkins' excellent book, Keeping Their Marbles, How the Treasures of the Past Ended Up in Museums and Why They Should Stay There. And can I recommend DCMS ministers treat themselves to the book for Christmas? In it, Dr. Jenkins details how the 1816 House of Commons Select Committee that investigated Lord Elgin's proposed sale of the marbles to the nation not only found he'd acquired them legally, but broadened their deliberations to weigh up the sculpture's aesthetic and cultural merits. They concluded the marbles' artistic magnificence was such that their presence in Britain had the potential to spark an artistic renaissance. The context for this appreciation, fuelled by Enlightenment values, was the 19th century interest in ancient Greece and especially the inspiring classical model of Athenian democracy that chimed with the democratic spirit of mass society emerging in Britain at the time. What a contrast with 2023. Anti-democratic trends are on the rise, and rather than publicly promoting these artefacts as inspiring embodiments of the world's first democracy, policy retreats into uninspiring pedestrian legalese. Additionally, it's become fashionable not to celebrate, but to demonise Western civilization. The Enlightenment and 19th century cultural figures are routinely impugned as representing white supremacy, racist privilege and so on. And unsurprisingly, the dispute about the marbles has been dragged into the sordid anti-Western discourse, and we're told the return of the sculptures will be a positive act of decolonisation. But like so much of today's Philistine politicised use of the past to score contemporary identitarian points, it bears little relation to historic facts. The notion that the return of the marbles would be reparation for what was stolen by British colonialists 200 years ago is misleading. When Lord Elgin acquired the marbles, Greece was under the thumb of the Ottoman Empire, not the British Empire. And indeed, the Ottomans were happy to sell them. They were indifferent to 19th century Hellenism or democratic virtues of ancient Athens or anywhere else, and the Acropolis served as a garrison at the time. Despite such inconvenient facts, there is growing pressure on museums, all museums, to repatriate their artefacts in general. And worse, too many who work in the sector behave as though their institutions are little more than repositories of ill-gotten gains of shameful colonial slave-owning past. We should instead demand that they act as public servants, trusted by democratic society to curate the world's treasures as guardians of historic scholarship and artistic appreciation. And in this context, it is crucial that the government urges the British Museum not to fudge the issue, and in the name of political expediency or diplomatic niceties. And I do worry that talk of loan seems to do just that. So can the Minister promise to unapologetically defend housing Elgin's precious marbles within London's encyclopedic collections as an aid to a universal understanding of human culture?
I'm summing up.
In the gap, may I say that the Noble Lord Lexton's speech was like a wonderful thriller. The conclusion wasn't clear until the end, but it was a marvellous conclusion to have and a wonderful narrative to get there. It's a great opportunity to speak in a debate called by my former boss, who is also the former boss of the chairman of the British Museum. So we know where the real power to make a decision lies. And also to have the first opportunity in my life, and probably the last, to say I agreed with every word that the noble Lord Frost said. He got it precisely right. This is not about looking back, it is looking forward at an extraordinary opportunity. It's about reuniting a unique piece of art, and if you say, where should that be housed, in the British Museum or in the shadow of the Parthenon, we all know what the answer is. It's about a great opportunity to make an extraordinary gesture towards the Greek people, our friends and allies, and it's about a great opportunity to forge an enduring bond between the British Museum and the Greek people, which will see unbelievable and unique treasures come to the British Museum, maintaining its status as one of the pre-eminent Hellenic museums in the world.
Yeah. My Lords, I also express my gratitude for the ability to speak in the gap and to thank my noble friend Lord Lexton for this debate, and also to declare my interest as a supporter of the Parthenon project, whose purpose is to share cultural and educational interests way beyond the marbles and much wider than is suggested even by George Osborne. I can't deal with details in the time allowed, so I would simply say this is not about losing anything. This is about a win, potentially a win-win situation if we can share. It's about the future and not the past. I sometimes think that this debate about the Elgin Marbles it's really, and I excuse everybody present here today, it's really like grumpy old men talking about teenage sex and merely the grubby bits. In fact, it misses the point. We are talking here about building relationships, about creating something that is bigger and better. And it's called soft power. We keep talking about soft power. Why don't we do some of it? It is, I think, in this world of distortion and deceit and betrayal that we see around us, isn't it time for us to, well, to put it for want of better words, to fall in love again with our friends and allies and move on and create a future which is brighter and better and filled with beauty for us all.
My Lords, it was a pleasure to pause and give room for the last two contributions. I'm going to start with really a message to the Minister which may help him in his reply. In December 2011, I was in his position replying to a debate about a pardon for Alan Turing. And I stood up and gave the set government reply, which had also been the reply of the previous Labour government. And 2 years later, In 2013, I then left the ministry. The then Secretary of State stood up and announced a pardon for Alan Turing. And all the careful wording that I'd used in explaining why we couldn't double-guess previous legislation or previous decisions just went. The government had decided that it was needed, in the spirit of the day, to pardon Alan Turing. The only thing that's left of this, if you look in any of the reference books about me, you'll find that there's a very helpful line that says Lord McNally refused a pardon to Alan Turing in 2011. Of course, no, I didn't. I was reflecting the policy of the government of the day, as the Minister will be in a few minutes. And so, in a way, a lot of the arguments, the legalistic of arguments, the historical arguments, don't match the fact that we are changing our views of what museums are for and how they play their role in their societies and in the world. And it seems to me that, and by God it'll keep me awake tonight, I'm fully in agreement with what Lord Frost said. This is a dilemma that has a solution, which is an opportunity. It is a chance for us to play on the big stage in a confident way about how we see our heritage and our future. Some of the ideas being put forward by Baroness Bennett and by Lord Frost, I've also said in previous debates, there's an ample opportunity to have a permanent partnership between Greece and Britain, between the British Museum and the Acropolis Museum, which would be a world standard in cooperation and exchange. But one thing I do know, coming into the early autumn of my career in politics, is that the idea that if you send the Parthenon marbles to Greece on loan, you'll ever get them back, is disappearing into fantasy. It is of such special importance and such unique importance. The craft, the political craft, is to set an agreement between our two governments, our two museums, that will leave the marbles where they should be, in Athens, but leave a legacy also, for both museums, of cooperation and an exchange, which is far more to the credit of both countries than this sterile old argument.
My Lords, I want to join with others in congratulating and thanking the Noble Lord Lexton for enabling this valuable debate to take place today, and also to reflect that I guess the debate sort of shows just how differently history can be interpreted by people coming from different views and different perspectives, and in that interpretation making for a very interesting discussion indeed. I too, as with Lord McNally, found some interesting points of coincidence of view with people I wouldn't necessarily have thought that I might agree with, but I found a lot to agree with what the Noble Lord Frost said, particularly about the value and importance of museum partnerships. My Lord, surely the point here is that this is a matter very much for the British Museum to sort, and George Osborne has been very vocal on this point, and if they and the Greek government feel a loan deal is appropriate and a way forward, then why would we want to stand in the way? It seems to me to be a path that would be wise to take. It will enable the sorts of things that the Noble Lord Frost was talking about to happen and form a sort of valuable pathway to bringing back some sense and rationality to this debate. And if we want a good example of recent initiatives in that direction, then we need look no further than the Horniman Museum. Some might say they were brave. I think that they took a very sensible and well thought through course of action in restoring to Nigeria the Benin bronzes and plaques. Now, of course, the ornament isn't subject to any legislative constraints, and the British Museum and other national museums are. And neither actually are regional museums. And I talked to the new director and the chief executive of two museums regularly. I'm a board member of the Royal Pavilion Museums Trust and also the People's History Museum. And we have sensible policies which enable us to have a discourse with those who believe that artefacts should be returned, and we operate within that framework, and good practice should rule this field. Now, the Prime Minister seemed to be shocked to discover that the Greek Prime Minister wanted the return of the marbles, and rather than have a grown-up conversation about it, he chose to throw his toys out of the pram. My lords, that is not national leadership. It's not what the country needs at this time. George Osborne's been leading sensible discussions about this for quite a long period. And these, as I've said, are very much matters for the British Museum and the Greek government to discuss. And we aren't going to get involved in a legislative argument on this or spend the sort of government time that some wish to by having a dispute. And I think it's wrong that we've picked a fight with a NATO ally just for the sake of a headline. And it shows really how weak our Prime Minister has become. What the Prime Minister should have been talking about, things like the economy, immigration, the Middle East. And that's what the country should expect from a leader. But Rishi Sunak is no leader. And when our leader met Greek counterparts, he focused on those very issues, and quite rightly so. So, my lords, I think I'm looking forward to what the Noble Lord Parkinson has to say to this. I suspect he will declare it's not a matter of great interest to him directly, but maybe he will, and he'll surprise us all.
Well, my lords, I'm very grateful to my noble friend Lord Lexton for securing today's debate on what he rightly describes as magnificent treasures of civilization and what, as he said in his opening, are objects which have long provoked lively debate in this country and elsewhere. It is important to be clear about this. The UK and His Majesty's government do not own the Parthenon sculptures. They were lawfully acquired under the law pertaining at the time. They are legally owned by the trustees of the British Museum, which is independent of the government. My noble friend is right to take exception to some of the vitriol and some of the ahistorical claims which have been levelled against the late noble Earl Lord Elgin as ambassador to the Sublime Porte of the Ottoman Empire, of which Athens, at the time he acquired the marbles, had been part for more than 3.5 centuries. He acted with the permission of the Ottoman Empire and removed about half of the sculptures which remained from the ruins at the Parthenon in Athens. They were purchased by Lord Elgin. The government purchased them from him, and then Parliament made a decision. Indeed, it passed an Act of Parliament to give them to the British Museum in 1816. I referred to the ruins. Sadly, most of these exquisite objects have been lost or damaged to humanity, particularly the tragedy in 1687 when Venetian bombardment ignited the munitions which the Ottomans had stored in the Parthenon, blowing the roof off and doing irreparable damage to many of the marbles. Of those which survive today, about half remain in Athens. There's a roughly equal amount in London, but important pieces are also held by other European museums, including the Louvre in Paris and museums in Denmark, Austria and Germany. As my noble friend and others noted, in the 1970s, the Greek government began a programme of restoration of the Acropolis monuments. As part of that work, all of the remaining sculptures from the Parthenon were removed to the Acropolis Museum. None, therefore, can be seen in their original setting. The first formal request for the removal of the Elgin Marbles in the British Museum was made by the Greek government in 1983 and was formally rejected by the UK government in 1984. Neither government's position has significantly changed since then. Unlike a number of other countries, museums in the UK are independent of the state. They're not run or owned by the government. Museums are charitable institutions run for the benefit of the public, and the responsibility for their collection rests with their trustees. The Noble Lord Bassam of Brighton is right to say, in a variety of ways, most not covered by statute, and those which are in differing ways. For the British Museum, the governing legislation is the British Museum Act of 1963. That, along with a number of other national museums, prohibits it from deaccessioning objects in its collection except in certain circumstances, such as when there is a duplicate, an item has significantly deteriorated, or if, in the case of human remains, they are less than 1,000 years old, or items that were spoliated during the period of the German Third Reich. There are no plans to change that law, and I didn't detect from the Noble Lord Bassam Brighton clamouring for it from the benches opposite. The position of the trustees of the British Museum is that there is an advantage and a public benefit in having the sculptures divided between great museums, the Acropolis Museum in Athens and the British Museum in London, each telling a complementary but different story. In the first half of this year, the British Museum had nearly 3.5 million visitors, so it is returning to the pre-COVID levels where it regularly saw 6 million visitors a year. Visitors to Bloomsbury could see the marbles in their full glory for free of charge. By way of comparison, the Acropolis Museum in Athens had 1.2 million visitors in the last year before the pandemic, and charge €15 in the summer or €10 in the winter. The British Museum is glad to share their treasures with the world, and people from all over the world come to see them. The Noble Lord Allen of Hallam asked what my view was. I think that is a good position. People from around the world are able to see these exquisite objects in London, in Athens, in the other European countries I have mentioned. For those that are in Bloomsbury, John Keats was moved to poetry on seeing them. Auguste Rodin was inspired to greater sculpture. I've had the pleasure of seeing them both in the British Museum and the Acropolis Museum in Athens. Both are superb institutions, and we learn a lot about these objects on visits to both. Noble Lords are right to talk about the importance of loaning objects. That is fundamental to the purpose of museums. Section 4 of the British Museum Act expressly allows for the trustees to loan objects in their collection for public exhibition. Before lending any objects, the British Museum enters into legally binding agreements with the relevant borrowing institution. Those agreements contain various assurances and protections, including about the safety of the objects when on loan. The British Museum has for many years said it would consider a loan of the sculptures to Greece as long as their normal conditions for loan are met. Indeed, it has loaned some of the Elgin Marbles in the past. As Noble Lords may know, the headless statue of the river god Ilissos was loaned to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg as part of that museum's 250th anniversary 9 years ago. The Acropolis Museum is an important partner for the British Museum. There is an exquisite object on loan from the British Museum to the Acropolis Museum at the moment. The Midas Hydria vase and previous items have been loaned to the Acropolis Museum as well. A prerequisite for a loan is the acknowledgement of the borrowing institution that the British Museum owns the object that is on loan. I must say, sadly, to Noble Lords, that the Greek Culture Minister, Dr. Lina Mendoni, recently, in response to a question from a Greek MP, acknowledged in relation to the Midas Hydria that that was acquired in 1772 by the British Museum and ownership is not disputed. But she went on to say that that does not apply to the Parthenon marbles in her view, and that there is no question of a lease or loan of these. It's very difficult, therefore, to see how a loan could be agreed between the British Museum or the Greek government while that remains their position. If the Greek government changed its position, and that seems like a big if, it has been their position for all of my life, then it would require an open individual export licence, which allows museums to send an object on loan for up to a maximum of 3 years. Crucially, the open export licence can only be used if it is guaranteed that an object will return at the end of the loan. My noble friend Lord Lexton asked about the reports which have been made of loans of 5 or up to 15 years. As I say, the open export licence provides for a maximum of 3 years. But given the legitimate questions which are raised about in this hypothetical scenario, the items being returned, I think it would be important that any loan did not extend beyond the tenure of any of the trustees who agreed it. They should be in a position to ensure that the guarantee required in the open export licence was made. But my lords, I wanted to end with agreeing with the noble Lord Dubbs and many others who have spoken about the warm friendship between this government and the Greek government. The Greeks are good friends. Indeed, I spoke last night at an event concerning some Greek marble in London, which both the Greek government and I are very keen to see moved swiftly. In 1882, a splendid statue of Lord Byron was erected in Hyde Park by public subscription. It stands on 57 tons of beautiful red and white marble, which was donated by the Greek government in appreciation and gratitude for Lord Byron's support for Greek independence. For more than 60 years, it has been stranded on an island far less enticing and far less accessible than those of the Peloponnese which Lord Byron frequented because of the coming of Park Lane. I have been working with our colleagues at the Royal Parks and with the support of the Greek ambassador in London to try and have that moved into the park proper so that it could be seen and enjoyed, and I hope that can be done next year, which is the 200th anniversary year of the death of Lord Byron. So I wanted to end on that happy note, because while this is indeed a long-running debate, it does not get in the way of the great friendship and cooperation between the Greek people and the British people, nor of either of their governments.
Motion for debate, the threat posed by North Korea. Lord Swire.
My Lords, I've been asked by a number of members of this House as to why we are having a debate on DPRK North Korea this afternoon. Why now? What has materially changed? And I went to the library a few moments ago and asked when North Korea had been debated either in this House or in the other place, and the answer was in this place in 2017, the debate instigated by my noble friend Lord Alton, and in the other place, in a German debate, which was brought about by Andrew Selous in 2014, and to which I answered as the Minister of State in the Foreign Office at that time. And, my Lords, many things have changed in the world since that time, and many things have changed, certainly in North Korea. And I do worry sometimes about the bandwidth that we have in terms of foreign policy. How often do we debate nowadays or even speak about Afghanistan? How often do we speak about what's going on in Syria, in Yemen? We are focused always focused on the issue at hand, current time, mainly Israel and Gaza, and we seem to ignore all these other things. And that doesn't mean to say bad things aren't developing when our backs are turned. And I would make the argument that whenever we talk about DPRK, there's a big international move to condemn them or to bring about some kind of conference or so forth, and then we all go away and forget about it. And when we come back to see what's happened, the result is always materially worse. And one day we might seriously regret our lack of attention. So if this debate achieves anything this afternoon, I hope it will concentrate the minds of those who are following the debate, not least those in Pyongyang, who will no doubt be given a copy of it, however sanitised. And the fundamental thing, my Lords, that has changed since 2017, or certainly since 2014, is the increased part played by the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea as part of an unhealthy, unwelcome, and frankly dangerous anti-Western axis. So in the time allocated to me this afternoon, I intend to highlight what is going on internally in that country, expose what that country is doing on the international stage, and make some suggestions for Her Majesty's government. My Lords, lockdown has been going on for some time in North Korea. They closed the country down completely and expelled the British embassy, all embassies in fact. But since that time, there is still now in Pyongyang a Russian embassy, a Chinese embassy, a Cuban embassy, and a handful of others. And our own ambassador has not been allowed back in, and they're still using the excuse of COVID and lockdown. That despite the fact that they accredited a new ambassador from China in July. But of course, lockdown, my lords, suits the regime, because it means that no international observers can visit the country, and this has coincided, unsurprisingly, with a huge crackdown on dissent. Prison camps are full, some of whom still in those camps are not there for sins they've committed, but sins allegedly committed by their fathers and their fathers' fathers. Increasingly, we have seen clampdowns on those who are watching South Korean films or music, some punishable by death if caught. And then there's the issue of malnutrition. Now, although there is no evidence of the mass starvation that we saw in the 1990s, there is evidence that some parts of the country are suffering very deeply from lack of food. In fact, there's been a complete breakdown in the public distribution of food. And the fact that the regime has made it illegal to move food privately from one area to another suggests to me that there is a very real problem there. But we are dealing with an opaque regime, one, incidentally, which has been hit by sanctions. Even those of a Panglossian disposition would find it hard to find much good to say about DPRK or its regime. And Kim Jong-un presides over one of the most repressive regimes in the world, and certainly presides over one of the most egregious and systematic human rights regimes abusing their people of anywhere in the planet. And I want to just spend some time quickly paying tribute, and I suspect Lord Alton and Baroness Cox, who is in her place, who almost together have kept the issue of North Korea going in the British Parliament, and I pay tribute to both of them. But I also want to acknowledge those brave people who have tried to escape from the hell that is North Korea. I've met some of them in Seoul myself in the past. They are incredibly brave, and so are those, even braver indeed, who have helped others to escape. And I just wonder if the Minister, because he's been asked this, I think, in this House before, if he has any knowledge of the 50 Christians who were sent back from China into North Korea and what representations the government has made on those people and whether any of them are indeed safe or indeed even alive. My Lords, it is easy and tempting sometimes to depict Kim Jong-un as a sort of rather grotesque Monty Python-esque figure of fun, with his cult following and his Potemkin villages. But all the evidence suggests that is very far from the truth, and he is a very focused individual, very focused on certain things which are very dear to him, above which is the maintenance of his family's regime. And I believe that bringing his daughter on increasingly in his public appearances is evidence that he intends for this regime to continue, and it is his way of demonstrating to the people of North Korea that the Kim regime will continue after his death. The relationship, which I'm going to speak a little bit more about, between Moscow and Beijing and Pyongyang is of interest. I think the relationship is largely transactional and not ideological, because their common enemy is the West, most particularly the United States. Interesting, for instance, on the vote at the UN on Russia invading Ukraine, Russia was only supported in that instance by Belarus, Eritrea, Syria, DPRK and Russia themselves. The Chinese did not support it. So there are areas of difference between the two countries. But Russia is the new player in all this. And relations have certainly picked up since the summit with Putin. We are led to believe that Russia is providing drones, satellite technology, body armour and so forth to the regime in Pyongyang, and in return for which they are getting shells, some of which are already being used in Ukraine, or there are questions as to their quality. These are being transported by train, and the missiles are being transported by ship to Vladivostok. There is also evidence that the DPRK, who are incidentally serial proliferators of arms and munitions, have been providing arms to the Wagner Group as well as others, and some of the Hamas arms have also been provided by Iran, which were manufactured originally by DPRK. My Lords, China is currently working closely in tandem with the DPRK, but there is evidence now that the Chinese are increasingly concerned about the direction of travel in the relationship and the closeness between DPRK and Russia. But at the end of the day, if anyone owns the relationship with that country, it is China. And if you're sitting in China, you are confronted with a series of pretty difficult choices and bad options, ranging from the possibility of a reunified peninsula, which may be democratic, may be Western-leaning. That is not agreeable to China, what with the geographical positioning of the peninsula. Full-on war between DPRK and the Republic of Korea. Again, that would draw other actors into the area and lead to mass migration into China, which is one of the things that the Chinese fear as well. So, much of this may now change because of Russia's increasing collaboration with DPRK on the nuclear programme, but in the absence of any other options, my own belief is that China prefers the status quo for the time being, at any rate. And what has the international response been to this incremental ratcheting up by the regime in North Korea? In all fairness, the Biden administration has provided more support to Japan, has helped bring Japan and South Korea together in a way that many thought some years ago would be impossible, given their complicated mutual history. And America has also helped build up a relationship with the Philippines. But we shouldn't forget that the last attempt to confront and to do a deal with Kim Jong-un was that attempted by Donald Trump at the Hanoi summit, which was a failure and left Kim Jong-un embarrassed by that failure because he had a loss of face, as there was no deal ultimately with the Americans, and if anything, drove him more towards Russia. And I would just say, my Lords, at the last American presidential election, or the one which saw Trump elected, the default position of HMG in those days was to support the Clinton regime. We weren't even allowed to engage with the Trump camp. I think, in retrospect, that was a huge mistake. I got into some hot water by saying that I thought Donald Trump would win. I would say this afternoon to your Lordships, I think it's not impossible that Donald Trump might not win once more, however desirable or not that may be. So I do hope that the government will start to reach out as the Republican nominee forms a shadow administration, because we may well be faced with that same situation once more, in which case we can expect all kinds of new initiatives. So, my Lords, we know what Kim Jong-un wants. He wants to maintain his regime at all costs. He wants to be recognised as a de jure, as a nuclear state. He's studied, incidentally, closely what has happened to those who have given up nuclear weapons. He wants diplomatic relations with the United States. And he wants massive economic aid. Of course, none of these will be remotely possible if DPRK continues with its illegal weapons programme. But doing nothing, is really fraught with danger. And there is a real concern now about relations between Seoul and Pyongyang, that something could go wrong because the North Koreans are not even picking up the telephone, which is the hotline between the two. So the risk of escalation or unintended consequences is very real and present. Which is why, my Lords, I believe that the government should do a number of things. First of all, I believe the government should push to re-establish the six-party talks. We were in the 20th year of them, if they were still happening. And I also believe, and I've always believed, that there is a role for the United Kingdom in those six-party talks, and I would like to see them become seven-party talks. Secondly, I believe we should press DPRK to immediately allow all international agencies back into the country, but back in together. Thirdly, I believe we should push very hard for the reopening of the British Embassy in Pyongyang so that our ambassador can take up his post. And fourthly, and others may want to say more on this subject, we should devote more resource to countering DPRK's cyber programme. They're getting cleverer and cleverer at this. Cryptocurrency theft, ransomware, 30 or 40% of the funding of their illegal weapons programme is now coming from this source, from the Lazarus groups and others who are thought to have stolen $2 billion since 2017. This is something we really have to, with our partners, double down on and deal with. Fifthly, I believe with allies we should push to increase sanctions. Now, the North Koreans are masterful at evading sanctions. So we should certainly have sanctions on the leaders in that country, but we should also have secondary sanctions. And this actually has a wider application. I think we should do this more often with other countries where we sanction people. Those that get away, the personal shoppers, the people who manage the London real estate, the people who look after the yachts, the holiday homes, anybody who has any connection with the leaders of a rogue regime should actually also suffer sanctions. And we need to do much more in this area, complicated, I know, though it is. And finally, my lords, we should work with our allies and the International Criminal Court on holding DPRK officials to account. Although they're not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, as are some other countries, unfortunately not, I believe we need to show countries such as this that if they continue to violate international norms in terms of joining in axes against Western democracies, they need to be held to account. And if they continue to treat their own population in the way that they have, they also must face the full force of international law. My lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My lords, the Noble Lord Swire, in a powerful introductory speech, has set the scene brilliantly in providing us with analytical and sharp analysis of the situation in North Korea, and the whole House will be indebted to him, but also for initiating this important debate. I declare, my lords, my role as co-chair with Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown MP as co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on North Korea and my non-financial interests in the Register. It's 70 years since the Korean War armistice, a war in which millions died, including more than 1,000 British service personnel who lost their lives fighting for the freedoms now enjoyed in the South, but not in the North. Last weekend, we commemorated the 75th anniversaries of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Crime of Genocide. The UDHR was to be, I quote, a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. Keep its universal application in mind as we consider North Korea. Keep it in mind in reflecting on an interview with an SKP just last week who'd managed to get out of North Korea with his family in a small boat. Among other things, he described how he'd been forced to watch the execution of a 22-year-old man who'd been caught listening to South Korean music and watching banned movies. Keep our commitment to the UDHR and the Genocide Convention in mind as we consider that 2023 is also the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights Violations in North Korea. Led by the eminent Australian jurist, His Honour Mr. Michael Kirby, it was mandated, I quote, to investigate, these are the words of the United Nations, the systematic, widespread and grave violations of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with a view to ensuring full accountability, in particular for violations which may amount to crimes against humanity. When it reported in 2014, it concluded that
North Korea is a state without parallel. It called for North Korea to be referred to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. Indeed, in pursuing the failure of the UN to take forward the recommendations of the UN's own inquiry, our all-party parliamentary group established a parliamentary inquiry. It followed up the continuation of human rights violations in North Korea from 2014 to 2021 and found that nothing much had changed in that respect since 2014. If anything, the situation was even worse. The UN Commission of Inquiry left open the question of whether a genocide is taking place. Since then, my lords, further evidence has emerged of the deliberate targeting of religious groups, which would fall within the Convention's definition. I would argue that the Convention also needs to be widened to include the targeting of political classes, whom Stalin's Soviet Union did not wish, for good reason of course, to see included in 1948. The Commission of Inquiry found that over 5 decades, hundreds of thousands of prisoners have been exterminated in political prison camps. But in the lifetime of 3 generations, entire groups of people, including families with their children, had perished in those death camps because of who they were, not for any actions they'd carried out, intent to eliminate certainly, but not, of course, genocide in a technical sense. Justice Kirby proposed a new term, politicide, to describe the atrocities. The Commission unanimously concluded that the state has committed crimes in North Korea that definitely amount, in a technical sense, to crimes against humanity, and it concluded that those responsible should be arraigned before the courts and brought to justice. Well, my lords, in this 75th year of both the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration, it's worth returning to the foundation documents, and in the case of the UDHR, it's difficult to see which, if any, of the 30 articles North Korea is not in breach of. Article 1 insists that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 3 insists everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person. And of course, without that right to life, all other rights are worthless. Article 4 abjures slavery, yet 90% of the wages of North Koreans able to work overseas are confiscated. Article 5 asserts that torture, mental or physical, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment is not permissible. Article 6 insists on the rule of law. 12 states that no one will be subjected to arbitrary interference with privacy, family or home. 13 requires the right to leave a country. 14 states that where there's persecution, other countries must provide asylum. 17 provides the right to own property. 18 upholds the right of religious belief. Article 19, the right to freedom of opinion or expression and to seek and receive information regardless of frontiers. 21 provides for democratic government. 25 deals with the right to food and care. And 26 with the right to education. How far North Korea is derelict in breaching article after article of the UDHR, and how far the international community has been derelict in failing to act on the findings of the UN's own Commission of Inquiry, can be seen by a cursory examination of the COI's findings. It unequivocally concluded that North Korea has systematically violated human rights, including freedom of thought, expression and religion, the right to food, and more besides. The state has committed crimes against humanity, and these are their words, their exact words: extermination, murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, forced abortions, and other sexual violence, persecution or political, religious, racial and gender grounds, the forcible transfer of populations, the enforced disappearance of persons, and the inhumane act of knowingly causing prolonged starvation. It found, their words, widespread, systematic and gross, unspeakable atrocities on a vast scale, amounting to crimes against humanity, and Justice Kirby said they were strikingly similar to crimes committed by Nazi Germany. The COI said the gross violations and crimes are, I quote, ongoing because the policies, institutions and patterns of impunity that lie at their heart remain in place. That was true in 2014, it's true now. And in the light of the evidence which has emerged from those thousands of escapees, there are around 30,000 in the Republic of Korea, there are about 1,000 in this country as well, Karim Khan, KC, the prosecutor for the ICC, should examine further the testimonies of those who were incarcerated or whose loved ones perished in the prison camps
because of their beliefs and consider whether this does indeed meet the test of the Genocide Convention. And if he's unable to do this because of the likely blocking vetoes of China or Russia, as in the case of the failure to refer the COI findings to the ICC, then an independent People's Tribunal should be established to consider that evidence. This could be modelled on the very successful independent Uyghur Tribunal, which looked at the evidence of genocide against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang and was chaired by the eminent lawyer Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC. In 2017, the Human Rights Council voted to look for legal strategies for eventual prosecutions, and it authorised the creation of a central repository for evidence, which was the right call, but prosecution has not occurred. And I hope when the Noble Lord the Minister, who has followed this, I know, in great detail and cares about it as passionately as I do, I hope he'll tell us more of where the accountability process and this question of impunity is now reached. Changes in the administration in both the Republic of Korea and the United States has also played its part in dampening the quest for accountability, although I do strongly welcome the Republic of Korea's most recent insistence, echoed in a conversation I was privileged to have with President Yoon during his very welcome recent visit to the United Kingdom and to this Parliament, that his government, he said, will champion the human rights of North Koreans. That is very welcome indeed. While international justice for crimes is needed, we must also look at other options, including under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Such prosecutions in the UK would most likely not be possible because of the very limited scope of Section 51 of the International Criminal Court Act of 2002. And this is an issue that's been raised by experts in the field, and the Noble Lord is aware of it. And until we reform our law, which perhaps an incoming government might consider doing, other countries, such as Germany and Argentina, which have broader universal jurisdiction, should be encouraged to address the growing impunity for these atrocity crimes in North Korea. My Lords, on November the 15th of this year, the UN General Assembly adopted by consensus in the Third Committee a resolution on the situation of human rights in the DPRK. It drew attention, this is as recently as November, I quote, to all pervasive and severe restrictions, including an absolute monopoly on information and total control over organised social life, further tightened by COVID-19 prevention measures. And the resolution related that these measures have led to food insecurity, severe hunger, malnutrition, widespread health problems and other hardship in the population. The prison camps, with an estimated 100,000 people being held there, are characterised by torture, brutality and degradation. My Lords, this is a country which, according to the 2021 report of the US State Department, World Military Expenditures and Arms Transfers, spends a staggering $4 billion on armaments, an estimated 26% of GDP, the highest proportion amongst the 170 countries that were reviewed. Yet it's also a country where people starve and live in acute poverty, while its leaders wallow in luxury. The Telegraph reported earlier this week that dictator Kim had been seen riding in 4 new foreign vehicles, including a $200,000 armoured Mercedes Maybach sedan. It brings to mind, my Lords, comparisons with the communist dictatorship of Ceausescu in Romania. In the face of all this, it was surprising, therefore, as the Noble Lord Swire has alluded, that on December the 8th, the UK government announced a package of sanctions targeting individuals linked to human rights abuses around the world, but that despite announcing a total of 46 sanctions, the government did not impose any sanctions on certain North Korean individuals and entities, where overwhelming evidence, including the FCDO's own annual human rights reports, demonstrate their responsibility for serious human rights violations. Although it's welcome news that the UK is actively using the global human rights sanctions regime, Magnitsky sanctions, to hold to account officials in Belarus, Haiti, Iran and Syria who are complicit in repressing individual freedoms, why, my Lords, perhaps the Minister will tell us, was there no mention of North Korea? It also underlines why a parliamentary select committee should be given power to meet in camera where necessary to oversee this opaque and random process. Over the years, I've made over 400 interventions about North Korea in Parliament, in questions, in letters, in meetings around this building. It's 21 years since I first raised the repatriation of escapees, which the Noble Lord Swire touched on. I did so in that first instance after a North Korean escapee came here to give his testimony. He described the plight of repatriated refugees. He said some have been executed. When returned, they face torture, interrogation and humiliation. Any woman who's returned and becomes pregnant while in China is forcibly aborted, supposedly to avoid the birth of babies contaminated by foreign influences. There are reports, he said, of repatriated North Koreans being corralled and bound together with wire being passed through their wrists and through their noses. That was in testimony here in the Palace of Westminster in the Moses Room. Hundreds more were recently repatriated, and I have repeatedly urged the government to raise this failure to protect refugees with the People's Republic of China, not least because the Republic of Korea is willing to give sanctuary and a new life to every single one of them. I've received a supine and hand-washing response that it's, I quote, for the parties involved to interpret their obligations under this agreement. We're talking about the 1951 Refugee Convention, of which China, which sits on the UN Human Rights Council, is in breach. My noble friend Lady Cox, with whom I've travelled to North Korea, will speak specifically about the targeting of religious adherents. But the UN Commission concluded, quotes, there is almost a complete denial of the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, while the charity Open Doors has again listed North Korea in 2003 for the 19th time out of 20 years as a state in which worldwide Christians face the greatest level of persecution. In the face of all this, then, we must do more than making weak tea statements of concern. We've got to call out issues like forced repatriation, the breaking of sanctions over weapons of mass destruction, the links to Putin's war machine and the day-to-day violation of human rights, and specifically a referral of that Commission of Inquiry report to the ICC. And we've got to continue to break the information blockade, not by short-sighted reductions in the BBC Career Service, which the APPG campaigned to initiate. Let me end, my lords, on a hopeful note. In 2016, the then North Korean ambassador and his deputy asked to see me. He read me a long denunciation for raising cases of human rights and for providing a platform for escapees. His deputy had been given the task of compiling all the Hansards and speeches and interventions in this House. He subsequently told me that it was his job to be my spy. A few weeks after my defenestration, my lords, Mr. Tae Yong-ho and his family defected. He later told me that through his observance of our parliamentary democracy and our way of life, he'd been convinced of the democratic case of freedom, human rights and the rule of law. Today, Mr. Tae is an elected member of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea, representing the Gangnam district of Seoul. He recently took part online in a meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group focusing on the likely fate of escapees who are being repatriated by China. I hope that he's the advance party for what will one day be a united Korea which upholds the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and gives its people the freedoms and liberties enjoyed here and indeed in the Republic of Korea.
My lords, it is such a great pleasure to follow the noble Lord Alton, who is such an incredible subject matter expert. I rise to make a brief and narrow contribution to this important debate, specifically on the role that the Royal Navy has played in enforcing sanctions. My lords, enforcing sanctions is never easy, but we are fortunate that the Royal Navy has a permanent presence in the Indo-Pacific, which is comprised of 2 offshore patrol vessels, HMS Tamar and HMS Spey. I should declare an interest as the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Singapore and had the pleasure of visiting HMS Spey 2 weeks ago. HMS Tamar has already played an important role in enforcing UN sanctions targeting North Korea's illegal weapons program. The ship patrolled the East China Sea in very rough sea conditions, ensuring items destined for illicit activities were not able to make it to North Korea. This is the first Royal Navy permanent presence in the Indo-Pacific ever since the handover of Hong Kong to China. And it is because of this presence that just a few weeks ago, during the state visit of the President of South Korea, we were able to sign an agreement, the first of its type, committing to joint enforcement of sanctions resolutions. Our offshore patrol vessels are small. They're 19 meters long. In fact, Kim Jong-un has luxury yachts which are larger than that, complete with water slides, all while his citizens suffer from extreme poverty. But in this case, size doesn't matter. In fact, we are better off having smaller ships in the region. They have tremendous capability and are very well suited for the region and the specific job at hand. In fact, they are perfect for capability matching with other Indo-Pacific nations whom we work closely with. Larger vessels can sometimes overwhelm the host nation's own maritime forces. But still, the design of these ships enables us to show the flag very effectively. They have an adaptable flight deck and bunk space for 50 people in case they are required for humanitarian assistance and disaster response across the region. So, my lords, it is critical that we keep them there. The region wants them, the region welcomes them. They are an enduring presence which also builds and reinforces cultural links, including to more neglected parts of the region in a less demanding or provocative way than a larger warships. My lords, I hope the minister would join me in paying tribute to the ship's companies of both Spey and Tamar. And I know he will agree that we must not take them for granted. To keep them going, a tremendous amount of work goes into ensuring personnel and supplies are at the right place at the right time. And this is no easy task, my lords. It is the tyranny of distance. We need to now consider what we do beyond 2028 when their scheduled deployment finishes. Should we deploy Type 31s to the region? Probably, but as an addition, not replacement to our offshore patrol vessels. I end by thanking my noble friend Lord Swire for securing this important debate and for his long-standing contributions to safety and security in the region.
I thank the noble Lord Swire for securing what I think is a very important debate, and I pay tribute to the noble Lord Alton for his very long and incredibly hard-working contribution to ensuring these issues do not disappear entirely off the British government agenda, and indeed are also brought to the public attention. Now, I think the condition of North Korea, the behaviour of North Korea, is one of the crucial issues on the global geopolitical stage today. That's one reason why I'm standing to speak on this Thursday afternoon debate. The other is a personal historic connection, because in 1998, 25 years ago, I was actually on the streets of Pyongyang. I was there as a tourist, having written on my visa application in my own handwriting, "I am not a writer or journalist of any kind." And it so happened that the first article I wrote for The Guardian Weekly, for which I subsequently became editor, was about Pyongyang. I was a lot younger then and did things I perhaps wouldn't do now. But it was a chance for me as an Australian who came to Europe after the Berlin Wall had come down to actually get some insight, no matter how constrained, no matter how limited, into that kind of society. It was the last kind of society like that left in 1998. And I think I really understood Orwell in new ways after being in that society in Pyongyang. The last morning I slept, or at least I think I slept, my oversight guards, and was able to walk out on the streets of Pyongyang on my own. And I understood what it was to be a non-person, because everyone, for reasons I entirely understand, looked through me as though they couldn't see me. They didn't want to acknowledge me. A street sweeper swept around me, around my feet, without ever actually acknowledging my existence. And the only people who did, there was a line of perhaps 10-year-olds who was obviously about to enter a building and they didn't have a teacher with them. And they were sort of smiling and going, "There's a foreigner over there," at each other. And I waved at them, and they waved back. Now, those 10-year-olds now would be about 45 years old. They will have never known what it would be like to live in any sort of society with any kind of freedom, any kind of opportunity. But I think it's really important that we actually look at the broader history here, because if we look back over the history of Korea, for about 1876 onwards, Japan exerted continuing crushing influence on the Korean people. What's known now as the Great Empress Myeong-seong was assassinated by the Japanese in 1895. Japan formally established colonialism in 1910. For the people of North Korea, there is, going back many generations, no kind of sense of a state or of a society that's given them any kind of real hope, any kind of normality, any kind of sense that there was an attempt to work for the common good. And I think when we think about North Korea, and we all know what difficulties there were in terms of the reunification of Germany, how difficult that was, we really need to think about the Korean people, the North Korean people, and the situation they're in. And I think, picking up the points, some of the points made by the noble Lord Alton, it was reported in The Economist that on the 9th of October, when North Korea finally lifted the COVID blockade, that up to 600 people were bundled out of Chinese prisons and deported to North Korea. Now, the nature of all of these reports is so often it's very hard to disentangle fact and detail, but there is, I think, no doubt that certainly a significant number of people were in that situation. And everything we know tells us that those people, if they're not dead now, are in a horrendous situation. And as the noble Lord Alton said, it is terribly important that we assert the right to asylum, the right to refugee status for the people of North Korea, for everybody, but acknowledge that North Koreans are people who are particularly acutely in need of that. And the term refoulement has been much in discussion lately, and this is a case where clearly there must not be refoulement. Now, I also want to pick up the points made by both the noble Lord Swire and the noble Lord Alton about hunger and food insecurity in North Korea. Now, going back to my visit in 1998, and the noble Lord Swire talked about how bad things were there in the 1990s, it was where I really learnt and grasped a word that had merely been kind of hypothetical for me before, the word gleaning. Gleaning the leavings of the harvest from the fields. And what I actually saw in the fields of North Korea, just outside Pyongyang, were a long line, maybe 20 or 30 middle-aged women who were going through a rice field, and each one of them had at their waist a small purse. And they were not young women, they were then picking up individual grains of rice, and they were going to get at most a small purse from several hours' work. And that's a real measure of hunger. And, I mean, we know that in March, the G7 foreign ministers noted this year the dire humanitarian situation, and also the fact that, of course, that we've heard a lot about the regime's exotic, luxurious lifestyle, but also, of course, we are talking about weapons of mass destruction and ballistic weapons programs into which vast amounts of resources are going. And I think I agree with both the noble Lord Swire and the noble Lord Alton about the need to think about sanctions, but to think about sanctions that do not force those middle-aged women out to hunt individual rice grains in the field, that do not leave the children of those that I saw, the children those years ago, going hungry, malnourished, etc. We have to be smarter than that, cleverer than that. We have to think about a future world in which we can ultimately see some kind of different regime and some kind of future for North Korea. And starving people is no way to do that. And I think the noble Lord Alton talked about Nijinsky-style sanctions, and Lord Swire also talked about the enablers in our society. And I have no doubt there is North Korean money here in London. There is North Korean money going through banks, law firms, real estate agents, and we have to do a lot more about the corruption problem, the huge corruption problem that we have in the UK. And that's something that we can directly do. And we also need to make sure that when we're applying sanctions, we apply sanctions in smart ways that address that kind of angle. And finally, I spoke a little bit about weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles. Of course, North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003 and tested its first nuclear weapon on the 9th of October 2006. The International Atomic Energy Commission has not had access to North Korea's nuclear facilities since 2009, And in 2017, Pyongyang conducted its first test of a thermonuclear device. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. It's perhaps a debate for another day. But I would note that the majority of the world's countries back the global treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. 93 countries are now signatories to that treaty, 69 countries are parties, 123 countries have expressed their support. We must aspire to a world without regimes like that of the DPRK, but if that does happen, if things go that badly wrong, a world without nuclear weapons will be a much safer world for all of us. The existence of nuclear weapons is a threat to all of us, and that will be the situation so long as they exist.
My Lord, like other noble lords, I'm very grateful to the noble Lord Swire for enabling us to have this debate and to discuss the current threats to peace, security and human rights posed by North Korea. I have been in North Korea 3 times, as my noble friend Lord Alton has mentioned. I'll never forget, on one occasion I went for a walk in Pyongyang and I heard the footsteps of my minder following me, and after about 10 minutes the footsteps accelerated. He caught up with me, he said out of breath, "I can't keep up with you, you're going to have to walk alone," which was wonderful. So I walked through Pyongyang without a minder, and it was poignant how many people wanted to come up and speak with me and how they shared with great openness their deep concerns. It was a very special occasion. And I'm delighted that there are today representatives of the diplomatic corps of the Republic of Korea here and an SKP from North Korea who himself has suffered great torture. And we know that people who have escaped from North Korea have great courage, and it's a great privilege that you are here. And we hope that you will find this debate, well, encouraging, because today's discussion is very timely. In March 2024, it will be a decade since the United Nations Committee of Inquiry concluded its mandate to ensure the full accountability for violations of human rights in North Korea. And as some of us will recall, that inquiry visited London for an evidence-gathering session where exiled North Koreans, including many who had found refuge on these shores, shared their harrowing experiences. At its conclusion, that inquiry found, and I quote, "Systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations have been committed in North Korea that in many instances entailed crimes against humanity." These issues have been raised by other noble lords, but I will repeat them because they do need to go on the record and be emphasised. That inquiry concluded by stating that the human rights situation in North Korea was, and I quote, "without any parallel in the contemporary world." As we prepare to mark the 10-year anniversary of the inquiry's report, we must be realistic and sober in our reflections. It is no great secret that impunity prevails in North community. No great secret impunity does not prevail in North Korea today, and there's still no serious prospect for implementing many of the inquiry's core recommendations to ensure that those most responsible for crimes against humanity are held accountable. Justice may be a long game, but I think we would all have hoped for greater movement in the past decade. The UN inquiry recommended that the Security Council refer the situation in North Korea to the International Criminal Court. They recommended that a United Nations International Tribunal be created, and also that the Security Council impose targeted sanctions against alleged perpetrators of crimes. These recommendations have never been implemented. Given the role of China and Russia in the Security Council, we may never see them implemented. Therefore, new approaches to ensuring accountability, including the United Kingdom's global human rights sanctions regime, must surely now be considered. I hope the Minister will comment on what steps are being taken to ensure accountability can become a reality. The current situation of prevailing impunity in North Korea poses an acute challenge to the legacy of the inquiry, the UK's foreign policy, to international justice, but ultimately to North Korea's victims, some of whom, as I've already mentioned, have found refuge here in the United Kingdom. Before I move to speak further about some of the egregious violations in North Korea and their impact on communities, I wish to clarify why the issue of human rights matters in the context of this debate, and global peace and security. Traditionally, there's been a separation in policy for North Korea, meaning that human rights issues and what are commonly termed peace and security issues, which refer to the country's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, are addressed separately. As my noble friend the Lord Alton has argued many times, there can be no tangible political progress on either human rights or peace and security in North Korea unless both issues are approached collectively. I'm heartened to see this now being reflected in the Security Council, where we have seen the United Kingdom, United States, European Union and other minded states begin to break down these barriers and approach human rights and peace and security for North Korea as a singular issue. The previous United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in North Korea highlighted the imperative of the international community to pursue leverage on human rights in a consistent, principled and effective manner. This included mainstreaming human rights into peace and security diplomacy, and it's vital that this approach prevails. I don't wish to dwell on this issue of policy, but I will clarify how the two issues are closely linked. We know from the testimonies of former officials that North Korea operates a slush fund, you may call it, where state resources can be diverted to fund its weapons programs. In turn, it is these weapons that threaten regional and international peace and security. According to the United States State Department, North Korea spends 35% of its gross national income on its military, a total of $3.6 billion. $620 million of this military budget is spent on nuclear weapons. We may well ask where North Korea, a country isolated from the international economy, finds such extraordinary amounts of money to bankroll its weapons of mass destruction programs. Well, we know North Korea raises funds through theft and extortion. In 2020, the United States Department of Justice charged 3 North Korean individuals for stealing more than $1.3 billion in cash and cryptocurrency from banks and businesses around the world. What is less well known is that North Korea also diverts resources that should be spent on feeding and sustaining its population, diverting them to its weapons programs. North Korea is quite literally taking from the poor to feed its insatiable desire to build weapons that are capable of killing millions. According to the World Food Programme, over 40% of the North Korean population are undernourished. It would cost us $79 million, which is just 2% of North Korea's estimated military budget, for North Korea to meet the financial requirements of its food security, agricultural and nutrition sectors, and to eliminate chronic food insecurity for its population. Yet it chooses not to do so. We can see that North Korea is sacrificing the basic and fundamental human rights of its population to fund its military machine. In this respect, human rights violations have become a generator of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction. North Korea's vast penal system is perhaps the clearest example of how the state diverts resources away from the most vulnerable to fund its weapons programs. Created under the Soviet civil administration in November 1945, the North Korean penal system is comparable to the infamous Soviet gulags. The purpose of the North Korean penal system is to isolate persons from society whose behaviour conflicts with upholding the authority of the supreme leader. Detainees are re-educated through forced labour, ideological instruction, punitive brutality, with the purpose of compelling unquestioning obedience and loyalty to the supreme leader, both while the individuals are in detention and going on after they are released. Many detainees in the penal system have no formal convictions, have experienced no due process, have committed no crimes. Simply reading the Bible or watching a foreign film may lead to a lengthy prison sentence. We cannot know the true scale of the prison population in North Korea. Yet if we take the US State Department's lowest figures of 80,000 detainees in the political prison system, we can start to understand its scale and question how North Korea can afford such a vast system. Both Australia and North Korea have roughly the same size populations. We know that Australia spends $250 per day on each of its prisoners to meet their basic human rights, such as food and clean conditions of detention. If we imagine that this basic cost of $250 per day per prisoner was being spent by North Korea on 80,000 prisoners, then North Korea would be spending over $7 billion a year on prisoners alone, which is twice its military budget. But based on reporting from the non-governmental organisation Korea Future and their North Korean prison database, we can confidently assume that North Korea is spending nowhere near that figure. In its report from March this year, Korea Future detailed the case of a North Korean man in his 40s who was arrested for helping people escape the country. Throughout his sentence of 7 years and 9 months in a re-education camp, he was denied food as a form of coercion and punishment. Pressed into forced labour, he was typically provided with a meal consisting of roughly 4.3 ounces, or 120 grams, of corn each day. When he did not meet his forced labour quota, his food was reduced to just 80 grams, which contained incredible elements such as corn husks, small fragments of stone, and wooden twigs. To survive, the man was forced to catch and eat insects, such as cockroaches and small rodents. And that's just one of thousands of cases that have been documented by Korea Future, and we heard about those situations when we were in North Korea. If North Korea is not spending its resources to ensure the basic and fundamental rights of its most vulnerable, where are those billions of dollars being spent? To quote our ambassador, James Karuki, at the UN Security Council in August this year, I quote his words, "The North Korean authorities divert resources from people's basic economic needs toward their illegal nuclear and ballistic weapons programs. We urge North Korea to prioritize the well-being of its citizens over the development of its illegal weapons programs." End of quotation. This example demonstrates why my noble friend Lord Alton and many others have argued that we cannot separate our policies targeting human rights and peace and security in North Korea. The two issues are mutually interdependent. I will end by discussing another human rights issue that poses a very real and present threat in North Korea, and that is the persecution of religious communities. Firstly, I must commend the All-Party Parliamentary Group on North Korea for their tireless work on this issue and many other human rights issues. It seems remarkable today, but at the creation of the North Korean state in the 1940s, religious communities, including Buddhism and Christianity, were part of the fabric of society. Many had played a role in the struggle for Korean independence from Japanese colonial rule during and following World War II. The Protestant community in what is now North Korea was estimated to be 200,000 strong in 1945. Despite suffering from waves of persecution throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Korean Catholicism had an estimated community of 55,000 adherents. Yet under the Soviet civil administration, and later the North Korean state, these religious communities were targeted by persecution, discriminatory legislation, arbitrary arrest, exile, and murder. Tens of thousands of Protestants were killed or fled to South Korea. Those who survived were forced underground in the late 1950s and early 1960s, leading to the creation of the present-day underground churches in North Korea. And Catholics suffered an even worse fate. According to the former Archbishop of Seoul and Apostolic Administrator of Pyongyang, by 2006 there were no known Catholic adherents remaining in North Korea, and no remaining Vatican-recognized institutions of the Catholic Church. All that remained were, inverted commas, show churches in Pyongyang, used to try and mislead foreign delegations. In reality, Catholics have effectively been eliminated from North Korea. A report by the law firm Hogan Loveless, which was commissioned shortly after the 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry, found evidence to suggest that this persecution of religious communities in North Korea may even amount to what can be called genocide. More recent evidence lends weight to this legal opinion. In its 2021 report, entitled Persecuting Faith, the non-governmental organization Korea Future documented 167 cases of serious human rights violations perpetrated against Christians in North Korea between 1997 and 2018. Indefinite life sentences and death sentences were handed to Christians simply for being Christian. Victims are generally aged between 20 and 59. It is shocking that even a child, aged 2, was also a victim. Korea Future found that in 11 cases, victims were believed to be still held in detention in North Korea, and their fates are unknown. It would appear that there is sufficient credible evidence to show that human rights violations perpetrated by North Korean officials are neither arbitrary nor random and are purposely directed at the destruction of Christian and other religious communities. These findings are supported by testimonies, internal government documents, and statements from former high-ranking North Korean officials who have defected. And this brings us back to the question of how can we ensure regional and global security from North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons, and how we can increase the security of the North Korean people. The first step in any response must include efforts to ensure accountability and to deter future acts of violence and aggression. In doing so, we should deploy all available options in our foreign policy toolbox, including bilateral diplomacy, consensus building at the Security Council in New York and Human Rights Council in Geneva, and the United Kingdom's global human rights sanctions regime. And it is the prospect of being targeted human rights sanctions that will end. The global human rights sanctions regime was established in 2020. The regime allows the UK government to impose sanctions in response to certain serious human rights violations around the world. The regime is not intended to target individual countries, but individuals or organisations involved in serious human rights violations. And it's with that message to my noble friend the Minister that I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. My Lords, we all owe a great debt of thanks to the noble Lord Swire for introducing this debate this afternoon, for having the prescience to bring it, but also to bring his immense expertise to the Chamber. And he raised right at the outset an issue that I think we should all, those of us present and those many members who are not in their places, should think about. There seems to be, in the 21st century, an issue of politics and international relations speeding up, and of governments, politicians and the media being unable perhaps to deal with more than one crisis at a time. It is only 2.5 years ago that the United States, and with it its NATO allies, pulled out of Afghanistan. That wasn't an unexpected incident. Your Lordship's International Relations and Defence Committee had written a report about the UK's role in Afghanistan and published it in January of that year. The government had responded to that report, and yet in August of 2021, it seemed the government had been somewhat blindsided by the decision of Biden to withdraw from Afghanistan. And that withdrawal and the West's inability to remain and support the Afghans once the US left sent messages to Russia and to China. Why is that important? Because in many ways, nobody was looking at Afghanistan at that time. Nobody was saying, what if there is a major change? And yet, for 2.5 years, thousands of people in Afghanistan have been fleeing for their lives. So decisions made on issues that haven't been thought about adequately can have major consequences. And yet, we don't really talk very much about Afghanistan at the moment. Ukraine, the next big international crisis, pushed Afghanistan off the front pages and seemed to push it out of the mindset of this chamber and the other place. And then we get Israel and Gaza. So there is, I think, a real issue, as the noble Lord Swire put it, of bandwidth. I think of it perhaps as the CNN factor. But in a conversation earlier, it was pointed out maybe it's the TikTok generation. Well, I suspect the noble Lord, the Minister, who will be replying to the debate this afternoon, is not of the TikTok generation. This may be wrong. He may be going to say, no, I've got it entirely wrong, and he spends much of his time on TikTok and Instagram. But I suspect not. I suspect, like many of us, though, he is of a generation that was used to events happening in a somewhat more measured, in a way that was somewhat slower and maybe took time to evolve. but wasn't followed by the media 24/7. But in the 30 years, really since Bosnia and the rise of CNN, we're expected to respond to crises immediately, but to switch from one to the next to the next. And so one question that I would ask the Noble Lord is not directly about North Korea. I will be coming onto that momentarily. But really, to what extent is His Majesty's government able to take the time to think about wider threats beyond the immediate? If the then Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab was blindsided by Afghanistan, being on holiday when apparently he couldn't swim because the sea was closed, that was an issue that had been foreseen, even if it suited ministers later to suggest that it hadn't. But North Korea is precisely the sort of issue, as the Noble Lord Swire pointed out, that this House and the elected chamber spend very little time thinking about it. How very different for Japan and for South Korea, and welcome to diplomats present today. But there is very much a question of what is His Majesty's government able to do beyond integrated reviews to be thinking about North Korea and the sort of unintentional consequences of the fact that North Korea has developed nuclear weapons. So wider strategic questions would be my first question to the Minister, because I do want to focus my remarks on the wider international. The Noble Lady Baroness Cox, and like the Noble Lord Swire, I would like to pay tribute to her and of course to my noble friend Lord Alton for repeatedly bringing questions of North Korea to our attention, because frankly, if they didn't, who would? Obviously, we now have the added benefit of having Lord Swire here to do that. But we need to be reminded in this country about North Korea and the questions that we need to think about as part of the international community. The title of today's debate is about the current threat from North Korea. As defence spokesperson from these benches, my immediate thought was of the international consequences, the international threats, but we've absolutely rightly heard from speakers right across the chamber about the domestic threats, the human rights violations that are being perpetrated every day in North Korea. That matters, and we should be thinking about that, and I would add these benches' support for the comments about the concerns on genocide and crimes against humanity. As so often, I would ask the Noble Lord the Minister what assessment His Majesty's government has made of concerns about crimes against humanity and genocide being perpetrated in North Korea, and whether now is the time to be thinking about naming genocide. But in order to widen the debate out a little bit, I would like to think more about the wider global consequences, which were well introduced by the Noble Lord Swire, but also touched upon in particular by the Noble Lady Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. Because aside from the domestic threats to the individual, to those very people that the North Korean government should be protecting, their own citizens, the defence of North Korea, that obscene defence expenditure of 35 or 40% of its GDP, ignores the citizens of North Korea. It's not about protecting the citizens, it's about the aggrandizement of the state. And the threats, the potential threats and the actual threats from North Korea are linked to the nuclear threat. They are linked to cyber and cryptocurrency, as the Noble Lord Swire pointed out. And there are wider questions about potentially the development of chemical weapons and the use of hybrid warfare. From the perspective of Westminster, most of those threats might seem very far away. But they are threats to our allies, to South Korea. We so very recently had a state visit. Issues of defence were discussed. Clearly, if the United Kingdom is to be a strong ally and partner of South Korea and similarly of Japan, we need to be thinking about how we support those countries in their defence and with our defence relationships. And so I would like to ask the Minister precisely what discussions His Majesty's Government is having with North Korea's neighbours, those who perceive themselves really to be at most under threat from North Korea in the international space. But that nuclear threat isn't just one that affects neighbouring countries. How effective the nuclear threat is, how effective North Korea's nuclear capability is in 2023, I suspect remains somewhat unclear. But what we're hearing is very much about, we obviously had the 6 nuclear tests, but very much the attempts to have intercontinental ballistic missiles and the ability to target the United States, our NATO ally. So has His Majesty's Government made assessments of the current nuclear capabilities of North Korea and what the potential threats actually are? And here I think we probably, across the Chamber, do differ in our views about what the implications of North Korea having nuclear weapons are for our own domestic nuclear stance. Because clearly, if we had a world without nuclear weapons, we would all be much safer. The dangers of miscalculation would go away because the threat had gone. But unilateral disarmament wouldn't get us to that place. And as the Noble Lord Swire pointed out in his introductory remarks, North Korea rightly looks at countries that gave up their nuclear weapons, such as Ukraine, and says, we want a nuclear weapon. So I think the question of who has nuclear weapons and what we do with them remains very pertinent. Has His Majesty's Government thought about talking to the 6 about further discussions on the nuclear capabilities of North Korea? And is the United Kingdom in any discussions about being part of those negotiations? Because if we think about the negotiations that worked effectively until the Trump regime was in government with Iran, the E3+3 had a very important role. So I think the UK does have a role to play. Is it playing it? Does His Majesty's Government see a role, particularly if we were able to reopen our embassy in Pyongyang? So I think there are many questions that reach into the wider international that the Minister might like to tackle in his 20 minutes when he's responding for once to relatively few speeches. As so often, we have a debate on a foreign or defence issue on a Thursday afternoon and relatively few people speak. It is wonderful to see that actually on this occasion, and I am deliberately saying this so that it's on the record in Hansard, that the chamber is not empty apart from the speakers. We've got peers listening very intently on this important issue because it matters. The security of North Korea's neighbours is not just a regional issue. There are global challenges here, challenges that affect the United Kingdom and NATO partners. But I want to wind up with a final set of questions about China, because China potentially can play an important role. It does have a mutual defence agreement with North Korea. It also is a country that traditionally is not in favour of intervention in other countries. So just as it didn't actively support Russia's intervention of Ukraine, despite that bilateral agreement with Russia almost immediately before the invasion of eastern Ukraine, so we would assume that it would not support North Korea being an aggressor. But is it actually playing any role as a mediator? And are we able to have frank conversations with China about this? And indeed, has there been a change in the FCDO's position in the last 2 weeks or is it 3 weeks since the former Prime Minister was ennobled in order to become our Foreign Secretary? Because it was very clear that during the coalition government, the UK's relationship with China was much closer. And while that was arguably too close a relationship, it is important still to remember that our relationship with China needs to understand elements of cooperation. It is not just about challenge and competition. And so, does His Majesty's government see a way to talking to China about being a mediator, precisely because at this moment it seems unlikely that we would have any opportunities of persuading Russia to say we will weaken our relations with North Korea when Russia needs all the friends that it can get. So, assuming that China is the main potential mediator, are we having discussions? And finally, in line with many noble lords, from these benches, could I support the idea that we need to be ensuring that we have effective sanctions, that the sanctions on North Korea should be targeted on individuals so that, as far as possible, they minimise the impact on the citizens. And I spoke on this question, I checked back, 5th of September 2017, where on that occasion Vladimir Putin had just said the North Koreans will eat grass, and that was the impact of the sanctions. My lords, we need to make sure that the impact of sanctions is on individuals, and secondary sanctions are vital so that nobody in North Korea who should be taking responsibility is able to escape that responsibility.
My Lords, I start by thanking the Noble Lord Swire for initiating this debate, and I think his focus is absolutely correct on sort of analysing what's changed, and there have been fundamental changes that do have a geopolitical influence, and we need obviously to take it into account. I also think it's quite relevant that this debate takes place just after a week after marking Human Rights Day and the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course the key element of that word is universal. It applies to us all without exception. And of course when it was signed as part of the United Nations, it was clear that all countries signed up to that. But of course the changes which I want to address that he's raised obviously are linked to the conflict we now face in Europe and other issues, the respect that, or the response of Russia clearly influencing a changing relationship. The axis that the Noble Lord Swire referred to is a growing axis, and that we obviously have to address. I do think the integrated review refresh, and I've got no doubt the Noble Lord Ahmed will address this, did focus on the instability that the DPRK can create in our relationships. And it's that instability we need to focus on. But I do want to sort of say that there is one thing that hasn't changed in North Korea, and that is the horrendous human rights abuses that have taken place. It's been a constant throughout its history, and it's gone from starving a whole population to internment camps, concentration camps, and annihilation. There is a detailed history of it, and we've heard from the Noble Lord Orton about this, and I pay tribute to him. And of course, like the Noble Lord, the Minister, who, you know, I have to admire his sustainability in post. Both he and I participated in the 2017 debate, so we've been a constant factor of this. But I do think that, you know, we should not shy away from focusing on those human rights abuses, and not shy away from building alliances to sort of address them in detail. And of course,
since their first nuclear test in 2006, the global community has been largely united in opposition to the DPRK possessing nuclear weapons. And it's just as important now that the world speaks as one to condemn this provocation. And I certainly, other noble lords have referred to it, I welcome the joint statement initiated by the US and signed by UK and a large number of other countries, which urges North Korea to abandon their unlawful weapons and of mass destruction and ballistic weapons program. But as important, that statement also urged them to accept the repeated invitations, and I think Noble Lord Swire is absolutely right to focus on this, the repeated invitations for dialogue, to abandon the weapons and instead dedicate its resourcing to improving the lives of the people of North Korea. And I've mentioned the integrated review, but also our ambassador in the UN, Barbara Woodward, who's been a great ambassador there. I know the Noble Lord and I, the Minister, have been talking about her amazing contribution in raising these issues. She said at the November UN Security Council that the missile tests are a clear threat to global peace and security, which is the core responsibility of the Security Council, and they violate multiple Security Council resolutions. But she also asked and called for, as the Noble Lord Swire did, for North Korea to reopen its borders and re-engage with the United Nations and all of its agencies, including the Security Council, to reiterate the depth of our resolve to combating proliferation, but also in terms of responding to the needs of the people of North Korea. And we should not forget that either. It is very, very fundamental. And of course, the United States, as the penholder, Security Council penholder, continues to provide global leadership for finding a diplomatic solution. But, you know, that is obviously now being impacted by that changing relationship that we've been talking about in this debate, especially with Russia. And of course, it's also, as we've heard in the debate, undermining the global non-proliferation regime. It appears that North Korea may also be providing equipment to attack Ukrainian cities and further that illegal war initiated by Putin. And that obviously comes from US intelligence agencies, as Noble Lords have said. And of course, the FCDO spokesperson at the time, you know, strongly condemned Russia's decision to source arms from North Korea and urged the North Koreans to cease its supply. It's also raised the issue, the FCDO, the transfer of money, military equipment and technology, bolstering North Korea's own illegal weapons program. So there is a two-way traffic here that we need to fully appreciate and understand. And that's why we do need an incredibly robust set of sanctions. And I think that one of the things that I think reference has been made to the diplomats here today, and of course the joint accord that was signed during the President of the Republic of Korea state visit is incredibly welcome. And of course it included a defence agreement. And as the Noble Lord Swire demanded, having a suite of sanctions isn't the only necessary requirement. It's having the ability to strongly enforce them that is very important. And that is why I think, and the Noble Lord Savras raised it, that we now have in that accord closer relationships between the Royal Navy and the Republic of Korea's Navy, ensuring that they are actually, for the first time, working together, the two countries conducting joint sea patrols to prevent goods and materials being smuggled into North Korea. That cooperation is not only important in terms of that specific task, but also generally in terms of the whole Indo-Pacific region, increasing security. And of course, as the Noble Baroness Cox mentioned, the UN panel of experts assisting the DPRK Sanctions Committee has warned that cyber attacks from North Korea are being used to steal cryptocurrency and generate revenue for its weapons program. And of course, the Foreign Secretary, the Noble Lord Cameron, highlighted this danger posed by North Korea's actions. He said in a recent Sun newspaper article that he had seen the briefings which make clear the risks of cyber attacks and industrial espionage coming from North Korea. So, on that point, can I ask the Noble Lord, the Minister, to reassure the House that the specific threat from North Korea is being addressed by the FCDO in its cross-Whitehall security, working to protect not only government agencies but also the private sector, because the espionage that is being conducted is not limited to state actors or state departments. And I think all of this shows that the leadership of the DPRK is more committed to provocation than to improving the lives of the North Korean people. And the Noble Lord Swire mentioned that the availability of food remains a major problem, and the World Bank estimates 42% of the country is undernourished, and I think that is an underestimate, really, because of the way that the DPRK is closed off from the outside world more than ever than before. So it's impossible to really understand the full scale of the suffering of the people. And of course, human rights are being constantly undermined. The continuation of that horrendous regime, intense surveillance, enforced disappearance, torture, as I said, and gender-based violence, all prevalent. And of course, Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner, has recently warned that the policies introduced to contain COVID are still being used to repress the population despite the pandemic waning. And Human Rights Watch have also warned, and this is a really important point I hope the Noble Lord the Minister will respond to, is those fleeing North Korea, if they end up in the wrong place in a neighbouring country, not just in China, but in, sadly, there's speculation about Vietnam doing the same, sending people back for what fate? Hopefully, the concentration camp. But what we do know, as Noble Lord Alton mentioned, far worse is going on. And we do have to ensure that we work with our counterparts and that the FCDO is committed to this in ensuring that the movement of people from China to North Korea is stopped, that we try and ensure that there is that respect. And of course, I think that ultimately North Korea, if it chooses provocation whilst allowing its own people to suffer, we have to respond strongly. And I think I agree with all Noble Lords that we should extend the use of Magnitsky-style sanctions targeting individuals. But as the Noble Lord Swire said, it's also those individuals who facilitate these. It's not just simply individuals within the regime, but it's how we can target those that facilitate it. I hope with those comments the Noble Lord will be able to respond positively, I think, to all the requests made in this debate.
My Lords, may I firstly join all noble lords in thanking my noble friend, Lord Swire, for tabling this debate. May I say my noble friend's introduction again reflected his deep insight and expertise on this area, not just as a previous Minister of State at the Foreign Office, but also his continuing engagement on important issues on the global stage. He highlighted quite directly North Korea's destabilizing behaviors have endangered international peace and security for some time and continue to do so. Just if I may, on reflection, the issue of bandwidth was raised by my noble friend as well as the noble Lady Baroness Smith. I was reflecting on my own day. I started with a Munich group meeting with the ambassadors of Egypt, Jordan, the EU, Germany and France. Followed very quickly this lunchtime I was hosting the E10 ambassadors, which included Japan and the Republic of Korea. And this exact subject was part and parcel of this discussion. And if I interject with that, with meetings on Afghanistan, including on women and girls and our humanitarian support, Yemen, Syria, and meetings with the Saudi foreign minister, followed by a meeting with the Bahraini foreign minister, together with my noble friend Lord Cameron, perhaps that does show that in terms of ministerial bandwidth, we are well positioned within the Foreign Office. But I understand and recognise what the noble lady and my noble friend says, because we need these debates discussed, and whether it's on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or for that matter, a Friday, I assure you the government will always respond actively and with detail, as I hope to do today. The noble lady, Baroness Smith, also talked about Generation TikTok. I may not be TikToked. TikTok was a clock when I was growing up, but at the same time, with children of that generation, I'm well versed, and in the many things that I have to navigate. I got a message just now that there's a dispute that I have to interlock and perhaps also conclude when I get back home, whenever that may be. That's between a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. Some would argue that's the most difficult of disputes to resolve. But I assure noble lords, on the serious matters which are in front of us, we are very much focused on the issue. Some history on this, of course, the tragic division of the Korean Peninsula yielded two different models following that armistice in 1953. In the north, as we've heard from all noble lords, the past 3 decades have seen North Korea chosen to develop illegal nuclear and ballistic missile programs at the expense of its people's livelihoods, threatening its neighbours and the international community. This is a breach of international norms, as the noble Lord Collins said, and we strongly condemn it. We encourage them to return to dialogue, and I agree with the noble lady, Baroness Smith, and my noble friend, Lord Swire. The door is always open. Negotiation, diplomacy channels should always remain open. We encourage them to return to dialogue, and will cooperate together with the international community as expressed in the UN Security Council resolutions. And I acknowledge, and of course will pass on, the warm words from the noble Lord Collins to our excellent Ambassador Barbara Woodward, who we met earlier this week. She was in London after a visit to the Rafah crossing. That these are an end, this dialogue, and end their weapons of mass destruction programs. That's essential. Agree a path to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and build a sustainable economy and equitable society for themselves, first and foremost, for all North Koreans. It's for their sake. But on the southern half of the peninsula, we saw the Republic of Korea took a very different route following the armistice. As a result, South Korea is now one of the world's largest economies, the world's second largest semiconductor manufacturer, and a key global trade partner, home to over 25,000 Britons. It also has astonishing soft power, something we promote. I'm sure that my lords, the noble lady Baroness Smith, said to me, are familiar with the works of BTS and Blackpink. I have a teenage daughter, so I assure you I am. I pay tribute to the creativity and entrepreneurial spirit of the Korean people. And as the noble lady alluded to, and the noble Lord Collins actually answered on my behalf, yes, the integrated review, and recently we celebrated the Downing Street Accord as part of a very historic first state visit inwards from the President of the Republic of Korea. I was part of the engagement that we had, and again, it was a real celebration of the bilateral strengthened friendship between our two countries. And this demonstrates where South Korea is. Turning, but my lords, to these aspirations, they should not be limited to just one half of Korea. A bright future still lies ahead for North Korea if their government abandons its programs, particularly those on WMD. So far this year, North Korea has launched 29 ballistic missiles, including 4 ICBMs and a military reconnaissance satellite, in direct violation of UN Security Council resolutions. The international community is clear this activity is absolutely unacceptable. Such provocations raise tensions in the region and risk spiraling into a regional arms race. North Korea has also fully restored its nuclear underground test site and can conduct a 7th test, should it choose to do so. My noble friend Lord Swire will recall that when he was Minister for Asia, North Korea undertook its 4th nuclear test, I believe, at that time. We welcomed the subsequent decision to halt nuclear tests and engage in negotiations, including, importantly, with the United States. Earlier this week, I met with Rob Floyd of the CBTO, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, to discuss the continuing concerns we have on this agenda, including those of North Korea. We regret that the negotiations of the US did not succeed. We, of course, regularly encourage North Korea to be positive to the offer of talks without preconditions, which have been offered by the United States, which we support, to reduce those regional tensions. But, my lords, it saddens me there is no international consensus on how to manage their provocations. For example, China and Russia consistently failed to condemn ballistic missile launches, which directly violate Security Council resolutions they had supported. Russia and China had supported these. Such divisions within the Security Council damage its credibility and can only embolden the North Korean regime. Another nuclear test would, in our view, pose a serious challenge to the international community as a whole. Even North Korea's close neighbours, such as China and in the past Russia, have strongly opposed such nuclear tests. The UN security must act with one to condemn such action, such illegal development. And I assure the noble Lady Baroness Smith and others we will continue to urge China, as well as, for that matter, Russia, to state unequivocally that they oppose North Korean nuclear tests. The UK is particularly concerned about the burgeoning relationship between North Korea and Russia. There was, as noble lords may have seen, a meeting between Kim Jong-un and Mr. Putin in September. There is emerging evidence now of North Korea's arms sales for Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. It is not clear what Russia intends to provide in return, but it's likely to be military and space technology. North Korea's track record of proliferation means that this deal could have dangerous consequences for the region and global security. To curtail these activities, the UK works very closely with international partners. Sanctions came up. I'm proud of the record when we introduced the global human rights sanction. It's something I've campaigned for when I first entered this House back in 2011. And I was delighted it got the cross-party support across both chambers that it absolutely deserves. And I assure noble lords we're very much seized not just with what we do in North Korea, but across the piece on how we exercise and sanction both individuals and organisations. And I pay tribute, if I may, again, and I seem to do this on, it should be a regular feature of any speech on human rights, to the noble Lord Alton, who we've all acknowledged, a great champion of human rights, and he continues on this very issue of the DPRK raised consistently. And may I join Baroness Cox and others in paying tribute to the APPG's work in this area as well. But we must work with our partners. I know the noble Lord Collins agrees with me, because it's a vital tool when it comes to sanctions to work with others, to signal our opposition, and in this case our opposition to ballistic missile launches. However, the UK recognises that sanctions are most effective when we can also agree them through the UN. Repeated obstruction by Russia and China in the UNSC has made new sanctions impossible, preventing the Council from fully implementing a point my noble friend Lord Swire also raised, from implementing those Security Council resolutions on DPRK, which have been agreed by all Council members, I stress again. And I think these things are extremely important. As such, the UK increasingly opts for a more collaborated sanction approach that builds international sanctions, working with our key partners, and counters, again, the emerging domains of cyberspace as well as nuclear proliferation. Now, my noble friend Lord Suffraz, the noble Lord Collins, also referred to the patrolling of sanctions. And I'm delighted my noble friend was able to visit one of the UK stationed vessels, the two offshore patrol vessels, HMS Tamar and HMS Spey, in the Indo-Pacific on an ongoing basis. Both ships support sanctions enforcement activity alongside G7 partners and conduct maritime surveillance. And I assure my noble friend, we will continue undertaking joint enforcement operations with South Korea, as announced during the state visit last month. That enforcement action will be underpinned by a new defence and cyber partnership, which will also include sharing information to more efficiently tackle maritime threats in the Indo-Pacific, and the signing of a strategic cyber partnership, committing our nations to working together to tackle cyber threats. But we also, as many noble lords pointed out, the noble lady Baroness Bennett, the noble Lord Alton, and the noble lady Baroness Smith, that we must reduce North Korea's ability to fund its WMD programs. As I stand here today recounting the scope and scale of North Korea's activities, all noble lords may ask, how can a regime rightly have asked the question, which struggles to feed its people, afford this? The answer, sadly, is simple: theft. The noble Lord Collins alluded to this. North Korea funds approximately 40% of its illegal weapons program via illicit cyber activity. My noble friend Lord Swire again brought attention to this subject. A recent UN panel of experts report estimates that illegal cyber operations have raised up to $2 billion until now. North Korea steals intellectual property, generates illegal revenue, and operates with relative impunity in the cybersphere. And that is why we, the United Kingdom, are committed with our partners to restricting the ability of their cyber actors to operate with impunity. As a thought leader in this field, we are raising international awareness of cyber threats, and I assure my noble friend, my noble friend who tabled this debate, that we are building a coalition of partners in this particular respect. The recent signing of the Strategic Cyber Cooperation Partnership with South Korea is an example of this, and it signals our commitment to upholding the norms of responsible state behaviour, cutting illegal revenue streams and reducing the vulnerability of the UK and its allies. My lords, we must never forget that it's ultimately the North Korean people who bear the cost of these actions, their government's illicit programs. Even before the borders closed in response to the COVID pandemic in 2020, the UN Food Programme estimated that 40% of North Koreans were food insecure. The noble lady Baroness Bennett again drew our attention to this very issue. The self-imposed lockdown can only result in exacerbating the situation. We call on them again to reopen the border. Only then can the UN agencies assess how much support the international community should provide. North Korea's citizens, as we've heard repeatedly from the noble Lord Alton, the noble lady Baroness Cox, and indeed all noble lords alluded to this, suffer appalling human rights violations, including imprisonment, forced labour, which are the positives, as the noble Lord Collins, and ultimately executions. So the lucky ones get imprisoned. The Foreign Office's Human Rights Report of 2023, which I lead on, has once again reiterated that the government severely restricts freedom of speech, religion, belief and assembly. And I will come on to those points in a moment. But the noble Lord Alton rightly asked about the Security Council. We held an open meeting in the human rights situation in the DPRK on the 17th of August, the first time this issue has been brought to the Council since 2017. And that's part of the drive, and I thank again noble lords for raising these issues. We've also recently, the UK was pleased to co-sponsor the resolution on the DPRK human rights adopted by consensus at the UN Human Rights Council on the 4th of April. At that time, I made clear in my contribution that we call on DPRK to engage constructively with the UN Special Rapporteur, Elizabeth Sam, to bring about permanent change and improvement for the people of North Korea. And I assure noble lords that we will continue to be engaging in this particular respect. The noble lady Baroness Cox and my noble friend Lord Swire also mentioned the ICC. The DPRK, I accept, is not a party to the Rome Statute, and I would hazard guess it's unlikely under the current regime to accept its jurisdiction. However, we are clear there must be no impunity, as several noble lords have said, for the most serious crimes. The UK has consistently and will continue to work to secure strong resolutions on human rights on the DPRK at both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, and will continue to raise these issues and also seek out appropriate action to ensure accountability, including strong consideration of referral to the International Criminal Court as well. What is very clear, North Korea's citizens suffer appalling human rights violations. We will continue to call them out on their human rights record and are urging others in conjunction to do the same. In response to North Korea's human rights record, we have consistently called out the violations of UN Security Council resolutions and will continue to do so. Now, turning to the particular issue of those who were returned from China, I assure noble lords I'm very much focused on this as well. The information is sketchy. Even recently, and I was reading the Open Doors report in this respect, and I was particularly taken by Timothy Chow, who himself escaped this particular, what can I say, abhorrent imprisonment. And we're grateful that he was able to come and work here directly, and I pay tribute to the work of Open Doors across a range of issues of freedom of religion. But equally, what we've seen is for those 600 or more escapees, and I assure noble lords, noble Lady Baroness Smith asked quite specifically, and others did, as did my noble friend Lord Swire, yes, we are raising it bilaterally with a country that has influence, which is China. In terms of traction, we shall wait and see, but the situation is extremely bleak. But we will continue to highlight this practice of forced repatriation of refugees in the international forum. And as noble lord said, they must respect the Refugee Convention of 1951. My lords, to conclude, the noble lady Baroness Cox talked about Christian persecution. North Korea, according to Open Doors, is the place, and there are many places where Christians suffer, but it's the place where Christians suffer most. So we must begin and continue to the transparency of the human rights and the sanctions procedure. I know what the noble lord says, but we do work with human rights bodies in this respect, and I take on board what his suggestion is to see how we can make that process more transparent, but he will understand the sensitivities in terms of our sanctioning of individuals and indeed organisations. My noble friend Lord Swire also asked about the six-party talks. They were formed on DPRK with China, Russia, South Korea, Japan and the US. It is a useful format which we very much support, and of course we stand ready if they were to be again taken forward to play an active part both in supporting them and indeed whatever role we can play in them. And we call on all countries to come together to ensure that DPRK avoids provocative behaviours, take steps to generate confidence and build a framework for negotiations that advances our shared wish for a peaceful and stable Korean peninsula. To this end, we do hope to reopen our embassy in North Korea, which has been temporarily closed since May 2020. We have asked repeatedly North Korea to facilitate the return of all foreign diplomats, but equally importantly, UN agencies, humanitarian organisations, as soon as possible. We have told their embassy that lifting restrictions on Chinese and Russian diplomats entering the DPRK, whilst excluding diplomats from other countries, is directly discriminating against others. Their argument that neighbouring countries have precedents in returning to normal proceedings has no validity under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and we will continue to raise this case. And, my lords, we will continue to look for ways to constrain their activity that breaches UN Security Council resolutions, whilst also, importantly, as all noble lords have said, to develop and strengthen channels of communication. As a final word, that door remains open, which promotes our shared goal, the shared goal of all noble lords in the chamber today who've made such detailed, insightful and expert contribution, a shared goal of a peaceful and stable Korean peninsula and a better life for the people of all Korea, North and South.
Well, my lords, what we may have lacked in quantity, Hansard will record we have more than made up for in quality. And whilst it would be invidious of me to signal out any one speaker, I am most grateful to all those who spoke and to all those who sat and listened. I'm also extremely grateful to the usual channels for being able to secure this long overdue debate. My Lords, I think all of us here will commit to keeping alert to the threat posed by North Korea and keeping the pressure up. And in that, I know we will have an indefatigable champion in the shape of our minister, whose record of his day sent a shiver of memory down my spine. One can only suppose he exists in expanding his own bandwidth as he takes on all these difficult issues around the world. He survives on a diet of canapés and Foreign Office Ferrero Rocher. But we know that he is fighting for us in these matters. My Lords, those of us who have stood on the DMZ in the safety of the thriving Democratic Republic of South Korea have looked across the abyss into the almost Kafkaesque regime in the north. And I would just say that as we go home to our families for the Christmas period and go Christmas shopping, the warmth of our home, the warmth of our families, food on the table, we should just pause perhaps and think of those people who are subjected to some of the worst human rights abuses of anywhere in the world by a regime with a warped ideology whose sole interest is in maintaining their own stranglehold on that country. And, my Lords, we owe them more than sympathy. We owe them more than warm words. We owe them our continuing determination to do something about it. Thank you.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.
The proceeding has ended.